The chamber smells like burning hair and old grief. That's the first thing Seraphine registers, not the silver rope biting into the soft skin of her wrists, not the cold of the stone floor seeping through her knees, not even the blood. The smell hits her first, the way it always does, because her wolf never stops cataloging danger even when the rest of her has accepted that this might be the end. She forces herself to breathe through it. Count. Always count. It's the only thing they can't take from you. The chamber is roughly 40 feet across, one exit, the reinforced door behind her, iron-banded oak currently held shut by 300 pounds of compacted stone that wasn't there 20 minutes ago, 8 torch brackets, 6 lit. The 2 dark ones are near the door, which means whoever designed this room wanted light concentrated at the center, wanted whoever was kneeling here to be seen. Seraphine had walked into this room willingly. She would not make peace with that particular stupidity tonight. You should have stayed gone. The voice comes from the shadows at the far end, near the altar. And it's a voice she knows. The shape of it lives in her muscle memory, in the part of her that learned to flinch before she learned to fight. She does not flinch now. She tilts her chin up, and she finds the figure standing at the base of the carved stone dais, robes the color of dried blood, face, finally, visible in the torchlight. Recognition moves through her like swallowing glass. Of course it was. The door behind her explodes inward, not metaphorically. The iron-banded oak detonates off its hinges in a single concussive burst, stone chunks scattering across the floor, and Seraphine throws herself sideways on instinct, wrists still bound. She rolls on her shoulder, comes up into a crouch, and the displaced air hits her with a smell so familiar it physically hurts. Rain, pine resin, the specific electric charge that precedes a dominant wolf's full shift. Him. Cale Dravenmore fills the doorway the way a storm fills a valley. He's not shifted. He's worse than shifted, he's between. That volatile threshold state that alphas are trained never to lose themselves to, where the man and the wolf share the body at the same time, and neither is fully in control. His eyes have gone gold. The blackened veins she'd noticed yesterday at his collar have crawled up the left side of his throat now, branching beneath his jaw like cracked marble, his alpha bond visibly fraying at its edges. He's bleeding from his ribs, 3 deep gashes, parallel, still wet. He takes in the chamber in one sweep, catalogues the figure at the altar, catalogues the destruction, catalogues the ropes on her wrists. And then his gaze lands on Seraphine, and something violent moves across his face that isn't anger. She wishes it were anger. Anger she knows how to survive. Seraphine, her name in his mouth, rough and stripped of everything he usually keeps behind his teeth. Are you hurt? Define hurt, she says, and her voice is steadier than she has any right to. The figure at the altar laughs. It's a calm sound, which is the most frightening kind. You're both already too late to matter. The ritual is past its midpoint. You can bleed him out, Cale, and it still won't stop what's already been set in motion. Kyle moves into the room. Each step is controlled, deliberate, the walk of a man holding something enormous on a fraying leash. His eyes don't leave Seraphine. There's a question in them he isn't asking aloud, the kind that lives beneath language. Can you move? Are you with me? Do I need to get to you first? 5 years of nothing. 5 years of silence and exile and a banishment order signed in his handwriting. And now he's looking at her like she's the only landmark in a collapsing landscape. She hates how legible he still is to her. She hates more that she is apparently still legible to him. Her tongue finds the inside of her back molar, the small raised ridge of the sigil implanted there 3 years ago at Conclave headquarters. A bite down, hard, precisely angled. And the signal goes out. Northern reinforcements. Pack-wide conclave alert, mandatory compliance jurisdiction, which means every bond in Silvermore's territory falls under temporary conclave control, which means Cale's alpha bond, already damaged, already blackened at the edges, would be the first to go. She watches his face and thinks, he knows what I carry. He's always known. The conclave doesn't send emissaries without teeth. He's looking at her hand, the one rising slowly toward her jaw. The blackened veins at his throat pulse once, visibly. Seraphine. Quieter now. Just her name. Just his voice, scraped down to something that sounds almost like the man she knew before he destroyed her. Don't. She holds his gaze across a room that smells like burning and blood and 5 years of unfinished business. Her fingers touch her jaw. The story you just heard is not where it began. To understand the choice she makes in that chamber, you need to understand what he took from her and why she came back anyway. This is Blood and Broken Bonds. From the beginning. Chapter 1. The border crossing at Silvermoor's northern ridge had 3 checkpoints, 2 reinforced watchtowers, and a pack-standard detection ward that could identify a rogue's scent at 400 yards. Seraphine crossed it at dawn, on foot, alone, at a pace that suggested she had all the time in the world. She did not suppress her scent. That was the point. She let it carry, cedar and cold iron and the specific crisp overlay of conclave-certified neutralizer, which wasn't designed to hide a wolf's nature but to announce their authority. And she counted the seconds before the first sentry caught it. 4 seconds, then shouting. She kept walking. The 2 wolves who intercepted her came in fast, dropping from the watchtower's access ladder with the practiced efficiency of a pack that had been on high alert for months. The larger one planted himself directly in her path, young, broad, a mid-ranking enforcer by his posture, hand already on the hilt of the silver-edged blade at his hip. Borders closed to... He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of confusion moving toward alarm. He didn't recognize her face. Not yet. Her hair was shorter now, different, and 5 years had changed the specific architecture of her features in ways that photographs didn't fully capture. But her scent, even underneath the neutralizer, even suppressed, carried something that Silvermoor-born wolves had been conditioned from childhood to recognize. A founding bloodline scent, old as the territory itself. His hand dropped from his blade. Who are you? Not a question. An anchor he was throwing out because he needed something to hold on to. Seraphine reached into her coat and produced the documentation with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this in front of larger and more hostile audiences. Gray conclave seal on the outer fold. Her photograph, her new title, her appointed jurisdiction. All of it legitimate, all of it earned. She held it out and waited. He took it. Read it again. The second sentry made a sound in the back of his throat that was almost a whine. Seraphine Voss, she said, since he seemed to be having difficulty forming words. Northern Conclave Emissary, 3rd seat. I have a standing appointment with Alpha Dravenmore. I suggest you call it in before I log a compliance delay. They called it in. She stood at the border crossing while the sun finished rising and turned Silvermoor's forests from gray to gold, and she breathed the territory's air for the first time in 5 years and waited for it to feel like something other than walking back into a wound. It felt exactly like that. She breathed through it. The escort that arrived 8 minutes later was larger than protocol required. 6 wolves, 2 of them senior enforcers, all of them wearing expressions calibrated to project calm authority and achieving instead a collective affect of barely managed alarm. They didn't touch her. The conclave seal made touching her a territorial incident, but they surrounded her at a distance that was close enough to make a statement and far enough to avoid the charge of obstruction. She let them surround her. She walked at the same unhurried pace. Silvermoor's main settlement materialized through the tree line the way she remembered it. The long main hall with its peaked roof and smoke-stained eaves, the cluster of residential structures radiating outward in the concentric pattern that all established pack territories developed organically, like growth rings on old wood. Some of it had changed. A new building on the eastern edge, larger than the others, what looked like a training facility. The old meeting hall had been expanded. He'd been busy. Wolves stopped in the common areas as she passed. She felt their stares the way you feel heat from a fire at distance, not quite touching, registering anyway. Shock, mostly, some hostility, a few faces she recognized from before, older now, recalibrated. One woman, standing near the hall entrance with a small child on her hip, met Seraphine's eyes and then looked deliberately away in a motion that carried the specific weight of a choice being made. Seraphine filed it and kept walking. The Alpha's hall doors were already open. Kyle Dravenmore was standing behind the long oak table at the room's center, both hands flat on the surface, when she walked in. He'd been informed the moment her scent crossed the detection ward she knew. He'd had time to compose himself, to arrange his expression, to decide exactly what version of himself she would encounter first. He'd chosen the Alpha, not the man, the function. He was very good at it. She'd always given him that. He was also larger than she remembered, which was an irritating observation to be making right now, but her wolf catalogued it with the enthusiastic objectivity of a creature that had never fully understood the concept of inappropriate timing. The years had settled into him differently than they'd settled into her, where she'd become leaner, harder, stripped of anything that didn't serve a purpose. He'd become more solidly present, the kind of physical authority that filled a room at a cellular level. The blackened veins she'd spotted in the intelligence photographs weren't visible today. He'd covered them, high collar, deliberate, so he knew she knew about those too. 7 seconds of silence. See, she'd been told, by the conclave briefing officer who prepared her for this assignment, that Alpha Dravenmore communicated more in silence than most wolves communicated in speeches, and that the content of his silences was worth cataloging. She cataloged this one. His jaw was set. His hands, flat on the table, were still. His eyes had not moved from her face since she walked in, which meant he was working very hard not to move them. The mate bond activated like a circuit completing. It came in 2 stages, the way it always had when she'd still been living on pack territory. First the warmth, spreading from her sternum outward, the specific, unreasonable comfort of proximity. Her wolf essentially sighing with relief at being near him after so long. Then, immediately following, the second stage. The bond registering the fracture, but the 5-year absence, the absence of reciprocation, and producing something that felt like pressing a bruise. Warmth and wrongness, simultaneously. Seraphine experienced both. She let nothing of either reach her face. She set her documentation on the far end of the table, maintaining the maximum span of oak between them, and folded her hands. Alpha Dravenmore. Her voice came out level, professionally distant, exactly as she'd practiced. Seraphine. Her name in his mouth. She'd forgotten, or made herself forget, the specific register of it, how he'd always pronounced it like it was a word in a language he was still learning. His voice was lower than it had been 5 years ago. Everything about him seemed lower, denser, pressed down by the weight he was carrying. The mate bond pulsed. She watched his throat move as he swallowed. There it is, she thought. He feels it too. He's always felt it. He signed the banishment order anyway. Your presence here is authorized, he said, because apparently he'd decided to open with bureaucracy, which was both cowardly and understandable. The Conclave's jurisdiction in this matter has been acknowledged by Silvermore's council. I know, she said. I wrote the jurisdiction parameters. Something moved behind his eyes. You've been assigned to this investigation specifically. I requested the assignment specifically. The silence that followed was a different animal than the first one. This one had weight and heat and a question buried in it that neither of them was going to acknowledge. Why? She imagined him not asking. Why come back? Why here? Why now when the pack is already bleeding? Because she knew what was killing his wolves. Because she'd recognized the pattern in the intelligence reports 3 months before the Conclave officially classified it as a cross-pack threat. Because she had been convicted of a murder committed by the same method, with the same ritual signature, and she had spent 5 years building a case that she could only close from inside Silvermore's territory. Because she wanted him to have to look at what he'd done. She'd told herself that last part was secondary. She was still telling herself that. "You'll be given access to the investigation files," Kyle said, "and a residence on pack grounds, per conclave protocol." "Per conclave protocol," she agreed. "I'll also need unrestricted access to the ancestral records, your enforcement captain, and the sites where the bodies were found." His jaw tightened slightly. "The body sites are still being processed. By your enforcement team, who are not trained in ritual forensics." She kept her voice factual. "I am. That's why I'm here. I'm aware of your qualifications." "Then we shouldn't have a problem." They looked at each other across the length of the oak table, and the mate bond hummed between them, low and miserable and relentless, and the air in the hall tasted like the specific tension of two people carrying the same unsaid thing in opposite directions. "Is there anything else," Kyle said, "that you require before you're shown to your quarters?" An apology, she didn't say. 5 years, my name back, the ability to sleep without the bond pulling at me like a tide. "The files," she said. "Tonight. And tell your enforcers that the next one who puts their hand near a weapon when I walk past will be the subject of a compliance report that follows them for the rest of their career." She picked up her documentation. She walked toward the side door that led toward the residential quarters. She heard him breathe, one slow, deliberate breath, as she passed. The mate bond screamed. She kept walking. Her quarters were adequate. She'd expected adequate. The conclave protocol was clear on what emissary housing required, and Silvermore, whatever else it was, followed protocol with the rigid precision of a pack that had learned the cost of regulatory non-compliance. The room was on the second floor of the Eastern Residential Hall, with a window that faced the tree line and a lock that she immediately supplemented with her own. A slim conclave-grade bolt that keyed to her specific thumb pressure. She unpacked in the methodical order she'd developed over 5 years of moving between assignments. Weapons first, then reference materials, then personal items last and minimal. She owned almost nothing that qualified as personal. This was something she'd worked at deliberately. When the files arrived, carried by a young female wolf who moved with the cautious precision of someone who had been given very specific instructions about deportment and eye contact, Seraphine spread them across the floor in the order she needed and sat in the center of them, cross-legged, and began to read. 3 confirmed dead. 2 missing, presumed dead. All low-ranking Cesa, Omegas, and low Betas, the wolves that packs tended to undercount in their threat assessments, which was part of why this had gone unnoticed for as long as it had. The bodies had been found at intervals of approximately 3 weeks. The pattern was spacing out. 4 weeks between the 4th and 5th incidents. Either the killer was growing more cautious, or they were nearing their threshold, the quantity of harvested essence they needed for the ritual to achieve its final purpose. Seraphine picked up the forensic photograph of the 3rd body site and held it in the torchlight. She had seen this configuration once before, 5 years ago, in a clearing half a mile from Silvermore's western border, kneeling over the body of the previous alpha, Kyle's father, with blood on her hands that she had not put there. Her wolf made a low, keening sound in her chest. "I know," Seraphine told it. "I know. But we need to be sure before we tell anyone what we know." She kept reading. She was still reading at 2 a.m. when the sound came, quiet, controlled, a single knock at her door with a specific rhythm that wasn't pack standard. It was the rhythm Silvermore's alphas used to identify themselves. She sat very still for a moment. Then she crossed to the door and opened it. Kale stood in the hallway out of his formal alpha's coat, in plain dark clothing, looking like a man who had not slept and had finally given up pretending he was going to. He was holding a folder she didn't recognize, not from the files she'd already received. His eyes dropped to the papers spread across her floor, visible over her shoulder, and something complex moved across his face. "There's a 6th, he said. They found her an hour ago." Chapter 2. The site was in the old quarry on Silvermore's southeastern edge, a played-out excavation that had been fenced off for 30 years, accumulated underbrush swallowing the chain link in most places, the kind of location that existed in a pack's territory as a functional blind spot. Far enough from the main settlement to require deliberate travel, enclosed enough to muffle sound. Whoever was choosing these sites knew the territory with the specificity of someone who had lived inside it for a long time. Seraphine noted this. She noted everything. The escort Kyle had assigned was a single wolf, his enforcement captain, a compact, stone-faced woman named Dara, who had been 2 years behind Seraphine in pack training and had apparently spent the intervening years ascending with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided early on what she wanted and was still deciding whether Seraphine's presence was a threat to it. She ran a flashlight over the path ahead without being asked and said nothing that wasn't directly operational. Seraphine respected this. Kyle walked ahead of both of them. The mate bond had settled into a low, persistent ache since leaving the residential hall, the specific register of proximity with barrier, her wolf interpreting the 3 feet of distance between them as simultaneously too much and not enough. She was acutely aware of his footfall, the cadence of his breathing, the occasional shift in his heat signature when the wind changed direction. 5 years of suppression and her wolf still treated him like magnetic north. Treacherous animal, she thought, not without affection. The 6th victim was positioned at the quarry floor's center, in a cleared space that bore the ash marks of a ritual circle, drawn and then deliberately disturbed, erased, the perimeter scuffed out, but not well enough. Ritual ash at this concentration left a signature that outlasted physical evidence by several days. Seraphine could smell it from the quarry's edge, wolfsbane and burning silver, the specific olfactory signature of forced bond severance. She crouched at the perimeter and pulled a small glass vial from her coat, uncorked it, held it near the ash line. The reactive solution inside turned deep violet within 4 seconds. "Active ritual residue," she said. "Within the last 3 hours." "We know." Dara's voice was flat, controlled. The recovery team caught the tail end of the scent trail when they found her. Lost it at the eastern fence line. Vehicle? Probably. The ground's too hard for tracks. Seraphine stood and approached the body carefully, stepping over evidence markers that the recovery team had placed. They were using proper protocol, she noted, which meant someone had either trained them or given them conclave standard instructions at some point. She filed the question of who. The victim was young. Early 20s, low omega ranking by the faint scent signature that lingered even in death. She'd been positioned carefully, not dumped, arms at her sides, head turned slightly to the left, which was the specific orientation used in the sundering rite to align the bond channel with the ritual receiver. Seraphine had read about the sundering rite in conclave-restricted archives. She had never seen it performed. She had seen its aftermath once before, in a clearing, 5 years ago. "The previous Alpha," she said, "Kyle's father. The report filed at my tribunal described the body position as consistent with a struggle." "It was," Kyle said. He'd come to stand several feet behind her. She hadn't heard him move. "No," she said, "it wasn't. I know what it looked like because I was there. I was the one who found him. His arms were at his sides. His head was turned left. The scene was arranged after the fact to look like a struggle. Yes, and whoever filed that description either didn't know what they were looking at or chose not to." Silence. She turned to look at Kyle. He was standing in the quarry's shadow, face unreadable, but his hands, she'd learned to read his hands before she'd learned to read his face, were rigid at his sides. The blackened veins had crept above his collar again in the dark, less easy to conceal now that his alpha bond was under stress. "You knew," she said. Not an accusation, a calibration. "I suspected," he said. "After the fact, after—" He stopped. The muscles in his jaw worked. "After you were gone." The mate bond pulsed, sharp and mean, and Seraphine felt it as a physical pressure behind her sternum. The bond reacting to the emotional proximity. To this, to the specific texture of the thing between them that had never been addressed and was rapidly running out of room to exist in silence. She turned back to the body. The Sundering Rite requires a minimum of 6 harvested bond severance essences to achieve pack-level effect, she said, keeping her voice in the register of clinical report. This is the 6th victim, which means they have what they need. Dara said it quietly, ahead of Seraphine finishing, which meant she already knew the ritual parameters. Interesting. Not quite. Seraphine rose. A 6th essence gets them to threshold for a single bond severance. To achieve pack-level effect, to strip an alpha bond and collapse the entire pack's bond structure simultaneously, they need one more, a primary bond essence, an alpha's. The word dropped into the quarry's silence like a stone into still water. She made herself turn and look at him directly when she said the next part, because she needed to see his face, and she needed him to see hers, to understand that what she said next was not a threat and not a performance, but simply the truth, as she had assembled it over 3 months of work. Someone inside your pack, she said, is building a weapon designed to destroy you specifically, Kyle. And they have been planning this since at least 5 years ago. He held her gaze. The gold wasn't in his eyes tonight. He was managing himself with the iron control that she'd always found equal parts impressive and infuriating, but the blackened veins pulsed once at his jaw. You knew this before you came, he said. I suspected it. Now I'm certain. And you came anyway. Obviously. Something in his expression shifted. Not softened. He didn't soften. She'd never seen him soften. It wasn't a thing he did, but adjusted, the way a frame adjusts when the picture inside it changes weight. Why? He asked. Just that. His voice stripped of its alpha register, dropped into something that was simply him, which was more dangerous than all his formal authority combined, because she had spent 5 years building architecture against the alpha, and she had never adequately fortified herself against the man underneath. The mate bond made its opinion known. It wanted her to close the distance between them. It had been wanting this since she walked into his hall this morning, and it was getting less subtle about the request. Because clearing my name requires a living perpetrator, she said. And because if they collapse your alpha bond, the pack fractures and the evidence I need fractures with it. She held his gaze. It's jurisdictional. Don't make it something else. He was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. She didn't believe him. She suspected he didn't believe her. They walked back through the quarry in silence, and the mate bond hummed between them like a live wire in rain. Dara presented the full enforcement file at the hall's war table at 4 a.m. 6 wolves seated around dark wood, haggard and grim, most of them senior enough to remember Seraphine from before, and managing their reactions to her presence with varying degrees of success. She ignored the management and studied the territorial map spread at the table's center. The site pattern, she said, picking up the marking tool and connecting the 6 body site locations. The line she drew was not random. It was a spiral, tightening inward. It's converging, she said. Each site is closer to the settlement center than the last. The killer isn't moving outward to avoid detection. They're moving inward. She touched the center point of the spiral, toward the ancestral hall. The Alpha's ceremonial seat, one of the senior enforcers said. The bond anchor point. Where a sundering rite would be most effective, she confirmed. They're not just building toward it. They're herding it here, toward a location they already know. Silence around the table. One of you, Seraphine said, keeping her voice level, meeting each face in turn, either knows who this is or is who this is. I'm assuming the former. But I want to be transparent about the fact that I'm operating on neither assumption as a certainty. The silence changed quality. She felt Kyle's attention on the side of her face like direct sunlight. He hadn't spoken since they returned from the quarry. He was watching her work, which was something she felt oddly and inconveniently aware of. Cross-check, she continued. I need the pack registry for anyone who had access to all 6 body sites over the relevant periods. That list gets narrowed by ritual knowledge. Who has conclave archive access or training in bond work? That second list gets narrowed by proximity to the original incident 5 years ago. She set down the marking tool. That intersection tells us who we're looking for. That'll take time, Dara said. Then start now. Dara looked at Kyle. He nodded once. Seraphine gathered her notes and turned to leave the war table, and Kyle fell into step beside her, which was not what she'd planned for. They walked in silence through the hall's corridor until they reached the split where her path went left, toward the residential wing, and his went right toward the Alpha's private quarters. They stopped at the split. The mate bond, Kale said abruptly, with the energy of a man who had decided to stop not saying a thing that had been pressurizing for hours. She went very still. It's affecting my Alpha bond's stability, he continued, in the specific flat tone of someone delivering unwelcome logistics. The degradation you saw, the veins, it started 4 months ago. Medical assessment indicates it's a suppressed bond stress reaction. When a mate bond is artificially maintained at distance for an extended period, the Alpha bond bears the compensation load. She absorbed this. You've been suppressing it, she said, for 5 years. Yes, so have I. The words came out before she'd authorized them. The corridor was very quiet. I know, he said. The Conclave's medical records, your suppression prescription. He paused. I shouldn't have access to that. You definitely shouldn't. I know. She studied the side of his face, the sharp angle of his jaw, the blackened vein that ended just below his ear, the specific stillness of a man who was very carefully not looking at her. The suppression isn't working anymore, she said, for either of us. Which means the bond is going to become a variable in this investigation. Yes, that's inconvenient. Extremely. Another silence. This one was different again, less hostile than the first, less clinical than the second, edged with something that had no clean category. Get some sleep, she said finally. You look like you haven't in days. He turned to look at her then. Fully, the way he'd been carefully not doing all evening. Neither do you, he said. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to be honest, short enough to be safe, and then she turned left and walked away. Her wolf took another 3 corridors to stop looking back over its shoulder. Chapter 3. She found the first anomaly in the ancestral records at 6:47 in the morning, 40 minutes before she intended to allow herself sleep. The records room was in the hall's lower level, stone-floored, shelf-lined, carrying the specific smell of old paper and cedar oil and thyme. Seraphine had been given access as requested, along with a lamp that gave off inadequate yellow light and the distinct impression that no one had been in here with serious research intent in several years. She wasn't looking for the anomaly specifically. She was building her cross-reference matrix, establishing which ritual techniques were documented in Silvermore's ancestral records versus what was restricted to Conclave archives, narrowing the knowledge access profile of whoever she was tracking. The Sundering Rite itself wasn't documented here. It wouldn't be. It had been classified and restricted by the Conclave nearly 60 years ago, following an incident she'd read about in sealed files. A coastal pack that had used it in a territorial dispute and eliminated 3 full bloodlines in the process. What she found instead was a reference, a margin notation in records dated 40 years back, in handwriting she didn't recognize. A single line beside a passage on the founding bloodline's bond anchor properties. See also, Voss lineage documentation, Conclave Restricted Series 7. She sat back on her heels. The Voss lineage, her family's name, attached to Conclave restricted documentation in records she'd had no idea existed, written by someone with enough knowledge to know that the connection was worth noting. Her founding bloodline status, the secret she'd believed the Conclave held exclusively, the evidence she'd been preparing to use as her legal lever in Kale's territory, had a paper trail inside Silvermore's own records. Someone here had known, possibly for decades. She photographed the notation with the small Conclave issue recorder she carried in her breast pocket and kept reading, more carefully now, with the specific focused attention of someone who had just realized the room they were standing in was more dangerous than it appeared. The founding bloodline documentation in Silvermore's records was, on its surface, historical. Territorial establishment records, bond anchor provenance, the legal genealogy of alpha succession. Standard material. But reading it against what she knew, the Conclave's restricted records. Of the Voss lineage documentation she'd spent 3 years gaining clearance to access, she could see where the Silvermore records had been edited. Selectively, surgically, pages removed with precise cuts, not torn, someone with patience and the right tools. References redirected. A genealogical chart that should have shown a branching line back to the Voss founding family instead ended at a neat terminus 2 generations before it should have. Someone had removed the evidence of her bloodline's claim to this territory, not from the historical record, from the legal record, the documents that would be consulted in an alpha succession challenge. "You're here early." She did not jump. She was proud of this. Dara stood in the records room doorway, 2 cups of something steaming in her hands. The expression in its default configuration of watchful neutrality. She extended one of the cups toward Seraphine with the economical motion of someone who had decided to do a thing without much theater about it. Seraphine accepted it. Black tea, no additions. Correct. She noted that Dara had either remembered or researched this. "I didn't sleep," Seraphine said. "Neither did most of us." Dara came into the room, not sitting, staying near the shelves, a position that kept the door in her peripheral vision. Old enforcer habit. "I ran the first pass on the registry cross-check. Results? 23 wolves with documented access to all 6 sites. 14 of those have some level of formal training in bond work, mostly PAC medical, some council administration." She paused. "Well, 4 of those 14 were assigned to the original incident investigation, 5 years ago." Seraphine set down her cup. "Names. I'll need authorization to release those names to a conclave investigation. The Alpha's authorization. He'll give it. Probably." Dara's eyes moved to the records spread across the floor around Seraphine. "What are you looking for in here?" Seraphine considered how much to give. She was not accustomed to trusting people, and she was especially not accustomed to trusting people in a pack that had already demonstrated a willingness to frame her for murder. But Dara had stayed operational and efficient throughout a night that had clearly rattled the rest of the enforcement team, and she had brought tea without being asked, and she had run the registry cross-check before sunrise. These were small things. Small things were data. "Evidence of deliberate record alteration," Seraphine said. "The genealogical section, specifically." Dara was quiet for a moment. "The Voss line." Seraphine looked at her. "I know who you are," Dara said evenly. "Not just that you're the exiled enforcer turned conclave emissary. I know what your bloodline means to this territory's legal standing." A pause. "I've known for 2 years. I found the same margin notation you're looking at. I didn't report it because I didn't know who I could trust with it, and because the implications were—" She stopped. "Large. Catastrophically large," Seraphine said. "Yes." They looked at each other across the lamp's yellow light. "If my bloodline claim is legitimate and documented," Seraphine said carefully, "and if those documents establish a pre-existing hereditary claim to the Alpha bond anchor, then Kale's authority in this territory has been operating without full legal standing for the entirety of his tenure." "Which would mean," Dara said equally carefully, "that whoever framed you and got you exiled didn't just want you gone. They wanted to prevent you from ever making that claim. And whoever is running the Sundering right now is trying to achieve through ritual what the frame job was supposed to achieve through law." Dara's jaw was tight. Eliminate the Alpha. Eliminate the heir. Take the territory. The shape of it assembled itself with the clarity of a thing that had been true all along and only needed the right angle to become visible. Not 2 separate crimes. 1 crime in 2 acts, with a 5-year intermission. "We need to tell Kale," Dara said. "We will." Seraphine picked up the records she'd flagged. "When I have more than a margin notation and a theory, I need the Conclave's Restricted Series 7 documentation. I put in a retrieval request yesterday. It should arrive by courier tomorrow." She paused. "And I need the names." I'll get the Alpha's authorization at morning briefing, Dara said. She moved toward the door. For what it's worth. She stopped without turning around. I believed you. When you said you didn't do it. I was 22 and a junior enforcer and I didn't say anything, and I have thought about that most days since. She left before Seraphine could respond. Why, Seraphine sat in the records room with her tea going cold and the lamp guttering and the accumulated weight of 5 years of knowing a thing that no one had said aloud until just now. She gave herself 60 seconds to feel it. Then she picked up the records and got back to work. The morning briefing was tense in the specific way that rooms full of frightened people trying to appear calm generated tension. A collective held breath, everyone watching everyone else's hands. Seraphine took a position to the side rather than at the table, which was a deliberate choice. She wasn't pack, she wasn't counsel, she wasn't subject to the hierarchy in this room, and she wanted that visible. Kyle ran the briefing with the efficiency of a man who knew his people were scared and had decided that structure was the most useful thing he could offer them. He covered the 6th body, the forensic status, the heightened border protocols. He did not mention the sundering rights threshold status. She noted the decision. Either he was protecting his pack from the full implications, or he wasn't certain he could identify the killer from within the room and didn't want to signal what he knew. Possibly both. When he finished, she spoke. I need to address the pack. Silence. Several sets of eyes moved to Kyle. He held her gaze for a moment, that 2-second duration again, the one they seemed to keep settling into. And then he nodded. She stepped forward. I know what I represent in this room, she said. She didn't raise her voice. A room that wanted to hear something would hear it. I know that my being here is uncomfortable. I know some of you believe I'm guilty of what I was convicted for. Oh, and some of you don't, and most of you are too pragmatic to care about either right now because you have a more immediate problem. She looked around the table. Each face, each pair of hands, each posture. I am not here to reclaim anything or adjudicate the past. I am here because 6 of your pack members are dead, and I know what killed them, and I know who benefits from it. And I need to know who in this room accessed bond work records in the weeks preceding the first death. The silence was different now, alert. You'll get that list through proper channels, she said, but I want whoever is in this room who knows something they haven't said, a detail, an inconsistency, a moment that didn't sit right. I want them to understand that my jurisdiction means they can report to me without it going to pack enforcement first. She paused. The killer is afraid of something. That means there's something to find. Help me find it. She stepped back. Kyle was watching her. She didn't look at him. The briefing concluded. Wolves filtered out. One of them, a quiet, gray-haired council administrator near the back, caught her eye as he passed and very slightly adjusted his path toward the hallway that led away from the main exit. The deviation was small enough that only someone watching closely would have noticed it. Seraphine noticed. She followed him. He stopped in the side corridor outside the record hall, checking both directions before he spoke. An automatic gesture, habitual, the movement of someone who had practiced discretion for a long time. There's a session log, he said quietly, for the ancestral records room. I maintain it. Was 3 weeks before the first body was found, someone accessed the founding records, the genealogical section specifically. He swallowed. They didn't sign in, but I saw them leaving. And? His jaw worked. It's someone who would have had no reason to be questioned about it. Someone with standing in this pack. I've been trying to... He stopped. Tell me, she said. He told her. The name landed in her chest like something structural giving way. She kept her face still. Thank you, she said. Go about your day normally. Say nothing to anyone. She paused. I mean that specifically. Not your alpha, not your captain. No one until I come to you. He nodded and walked away. Seraphine stood in the corridor for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went to find Kyle. Because what she was about to do, she was not going to do without him knowing first, and because there was a version of the next 48 hours in which the information she'd just received got someone else killed, and she needed to make sure he understood what they were walking into before they walked into it. She found him in the hall's eastern corridor, alone, heading toward the Alpha's study, and she fell into step beside him without preamble. "I have a name," she said. He stopped. She met his eyes. "It's going to be difficult," she said. "Are you ready?" He looked at her. That full, stripped-down look, the one that bypassed the Alpha entirely, and something in him settled. Not relaxed. Settled. The difference between a person bracing for impact and a person accepting that impact was coming and choosing to face it standing. "Tell me," he said. The mate bond was very quiet, like a held breath. She told him. Chapter 4. The name was Councilman Aldrich Vane. Seraphine watched it move through Kale the way a fault line moves through rock. Not explosively, not immediately, but with the slow, inexorable pressure of something geological. His face didn't change, his hands didn't move, but the blackened veins at his jaw pulsed once, visibly, and the air around him shifted in the specific way that dominant wolves' bodies betrayed them when their control was being genuinely tested. Aldrich Vane had been Silvermore's senior council administrator for 23 years. He had served under Kale's father. He had been the one to formally read Seraphine's banishment order at her tribunal. He had placed the exile seal on her documentation with his own hand, and he had not looked at her while he did it. And she had interpreted that at the time as shame. She understood now it was something else entirely. "He was at the tribunal," Kale said. His voice was very flat. "He helped design it," Seraphine said. "He would have needed to ensure the evidence framework held. The forensic misdirection alone required someone with access to the original scene and the investigation filing system." She paused. "He has both. He always has." Kyle turned and walked to the window at the corridor's end. He stood with his back to her, both hands on the sill, looking out at the settlement's morning activity. Wolves moving through the common areas, children in the training yard, the specific texture of a community that did not know it was standing on a fracture. She gave him 30 seconds. This was more than she gave most people, and she was aware of this. "He was my father's closest advisor," Kyle said. "I know." "He was at the funeral." A pause. "He was the one who told me you were found at the scene. He came to me personally. He said—" Kale's jaw tightened until the muscle at its hinge went white. "He was very specific about what he said you had done." "He would be," Seraphine said. "He needed you to act quickly, before you thought about it." "I did act quickly." The words came out with the specific weight of something that had been carried for a long time, pressing through the floor of a carefully maintained composure. "I acted in 48 hours. I had you in front of a tribunal before—" He stopped. "I was 27. My father had been dead for 4 days. And Aldrich came to me with evidence and testimony and certainty, and I—" "Needed certainty," Seraphine said. Not softly. She wasn't performing softness, but evenly, with the recognition of someone who had spent 5 years understanding exactly what had happened and why, even when understanding it brought her no comfort whatsoever. He turned from the window. She had not prepared for his face. She had prepared for many things: the investigation, the mate bond, the confrontation with Silvermore's geography and its accumulated weight of memory. But she had not prepared for the specific expression currently occupying his face, which was not alpha authority or formal detachment or even managed guilt. It was grief. Unguarded, direct, but the grief of someone who had finally located the specific room inside themselves where they'd been storing a thing they weren't ready to look at. "Seraphine," he said. "Don't." Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Not right now. We have a timeline problem and a council administrator who knows we're investigating, who very likely knows his session log has a gap in it, and who has enough access to this PAC's infrastructure to complicate the next 48 hours substantially." She held his gaze. "We need to move. Grief the rest later." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, One short, controlled motion, and the Alpha came back into his posture like a key turning in a lock. "What do you need?" he said. "Aldrich's communications for the past 6 months, his access logs, any personal documentation he keeps in council chambers." She paused. "And I need to know if he has a private space, a residence annex, a study outside the main hall, anywhere not covered by standard pack security." "He has a residence on the northern edge. Old structure from his early tenure. Pack granted." Kyle straightened. "He's rarely there." "Then that's where the ritual components are," Seraphine said. "Wherever he's been storing 6 harvested bond severance essences, it isn't somewhere he walks past daily. He'd be aware of the olfactory risk." Kyle reached for the communication device at his belt. Stopped. He looked at her. "If I contact Dara through standard channels," he said, "and Aldrich has council access to communication logs." "He does," Seraphine said. "Then we can't use standard channels." "No." She reached into her coat and produced a small conclave-issue communicator, sealed frequency, untappable by pack infrastructure. "Use this. It routes through conclave relay. He won't be able to monitor it." He took it from her. Their fingers didn't touch. She was very precise about this. He was precise about it too. She noted this. "Dara," he said into the communicator, and his voice had shifted, low, direct, the specific register of an Alpha operating under threat conditions. "Northern residence, Vane's property, quiet entry, report only to me." A pause. "Yes, now." He handed the communicator back. "She'll need 20 minutes, he said. "Then we have 20 minutes. They stood in the corridor, and the morning light came through the window at the end and lay across the floor between them. May and the mate bond did the thing it had been doing since she arrived. That low, persistent, exhausting pull, like tide toward shore, like a compass finding north. And neither of them said anything about it. "The conclave documents," he said, eventually. "The restricted series. Your bloodline claim." She looked at him carefully. "Who told you?" "No one. I've known about the Voss lineage's founding claim for 3 years. He met her gaze directly. "My father told me, before he died. He said it was something the council would need to address eventually, formally, through proper channels." A pause. "I didn't know it was you, specifically. The documentation I had access to was incomplete, deliberately, as it turns out." Aldrich removed the connecting records. "Yes," she absorbed this. "Your father knew about the claim and didn't act on it. He said it was complicated." Kale's jaw moved. "He was going to consult the conclave. He stopped. "He was killed 4 days later." The shape of the full conspiracy settled into clarity with a precision that was almost architectural. Aldrich had known about the founding claim, had known it would eventually surface and legally complicate Silvermore's Alpha succession, would complicate Kale's position specifically, because if Seraphine's bloodline claim was primary, Kale's Alpha bond existed in disputed territory, had killed the previous Alpha before he could legitimize the claim through official channels, had framed Seraphine to remove the claimant from the territory and manufacture a justification for permanent exile, had spent 5 years quietly harvesting the components for a sundering rite that would eliminate Kale entirely, because framing and exile hadn't been enough, because Seraphine came back, because the conclave had given her legal standing and a path back to the territory, and Aldrich needed a faster solution. "He needs both of us gone," Seraphine said. "Your Alpha bond severed, which collapses pack authority. My claim eliminated, which removes the legitimate heir. Without either of us, the territory falls into conclave administrative control, and a council administrator with long tenure and manufactured documentation could position himself as the logical interim authority." "He takes the pack," Kyle said. "He takes the pack." Silence. The communicator in her coat pocket buzzed once, Dara's confirmation signal. A single pulse that meant on-site. "We need to go," Seraphine said. "Together?" He said it without inflection, which made it a genuine question rather than a challenge. She thought about it for the length of a breath, weighed the operational logic, The mate bond's increasingly inconvenient volatility, the particular risk of putting themselves in proximity to an active ritual site with a fraying alpha bond and a suppression medication that had stopped working. "Together," she said. The word sat between them, brief and loaded, meaning at least 3 things neither of them was going to enumerate in a corridor at 7 in the morning. They moved. Aldrich Vane's northern residence was a stone structure 2 centuries old, built against the ridge's base in the style of Silvermore's founding era. Thick walls, deep-set windows, the architectural language of a pack that had expected to defend itself. Ivy had consumed most of the eastern face. The approach path had been used recently. The undergrowth showed fresh disturbance, not pack-standard boot prints, but a heavier, single-person pattern. Dara was waiting at the structure's western corner when they arrived, back flat to the stone, expression doing its default thing. "No current occupant," she said quietly, "but there's a cellar access on the north face that's been opened within the last 24 hours. Fresh scrape marks on the stone. And the scent," she paused, which for Dara was the equivalent of a dramatic statement. "It's bad." Seraphine smelled it before they rounded the corner. Wolfsbane, Silverburn, and underneath both, the specific sweet rot signature of harvested bond essence in concentrated quantity. 6 essences, stored together, interacting. Her wolf recoiled from it. The mate bond, which had been maintaining its persistent low frequency, spiked sharply in response. Her wolf interpreting the scent of bond destruction as immediate threat to their bond, reacting with an urgency that bypassed rational processing entirely. Beside her, Kyle made a sound that wasn't quite a growl. The blackened veins at his jaw went dark. "The alpha bond responds to ritual essence proximity," Seraphine said crisply. "Don't shift, don't go half-state, stay human." She looked at him directly. "Can you do that?" His gold eyes found hers. "Yes." "Then stay close." She moved toward the cellar access, a heavy stone panel set flush with the north face. All lifted by a recessed iron ring, recent tool marks around the edge. She pulled it up, and the smell intensified, rich and wrong, and below was a stone staircase descending into lamplight. Someone was still here. She processed this in the 2 seconds it took the lamplight to register. Held up a fist. "Stop." Looked at Dara, who had already drawn her silver-edged blade and flattened against the outer wall. Looked at Kale, who was directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat his body was throwing. Elevated, the alpha bond running hot under stress, his wolf very close to the surface. Too close. She could feel it in the mate bond, his wolf calling to hers, the biological imperative of a bonded pair under threat. Stay together, protect, hold. She took a breath and descended the stairs. The cellar was a single stone room, roughly 30 feet across, lit by 4 oil lamps arranged at the corners. In the center was a ritual circle that was not yet complete. The ash lines drawn, the 6 containment points set, but the activation sequence unfinished. Aldrich Vane was standing at the circle's far edge, his back to them, hands moving over a small table covered in components. He stilled, then turned. He looked at first like the man she'd known, gray-haired, composed, the specific authority of someone who had occupied institutional power for long enough that it had shaped his posture. But there was something in his face now that administrative composure had always covered, and the composure was gone. What remained was older and colder, and very aware that the variables had just changed catastrophically. "Seraphine," he said. His voice was steady. She gave him that. "And the alpha." His eyes moved to Kale. "I'd hoped to have more time." "The 6th body was sloppy," Seraphine said. "You were rushing. The timing window on the 6th essence is shorter than the others. If you don't activate the right within 48 hours of the final harvest, the bond essence degrades and you lose threshold. You didn't plan for us to identify the spiral this quickly." Something shifted in his expression. Respect, she thought, which was the most infuriating possible response. You were always the problem, he said, almost conversationally. Even 22 years ago, when I first identified the Voss lineage documentation, I knew you would be the problem. A founding bloodline heir active in the territory with an alpha as her fated mate. He tilted his head. The legal complications alone would have been sufficient. Then you turned out to be competent as well. Tragic for you, she said. The old alpha was going to legitimize your claim, Aldrich continued. Formally, conclave channels, full documentation. It would have taken 2 years to process, but it would have held. It would have... His jaw tightened slightly, the first crack in the composure. It would have ended 60 years of work, my grandfather's work, my father's work, 3 generations of positioning, of managing this pack's council, of maintaining the bloodline of the correct alpha line. He stopped. Cale's family usurped this territory. The Dravenmore bond anchor claim has always been secondary. I have documentation that predates theirs by 4 generations. The silence that followed was very loud. Miss Seraphine kept her eyes on Aldrich's hands. He had not moved away from the component table, which meant access to the ritual components was still possible. Kyle had gone entirely still behind her. She didn't look at him. She needed her eyes forward. So this was always about succession, Kyle said. His voice was controlled in the way of something controlled by force. Not territorial threat, not external faction, you. I have managed this territory with more genuine care than your family ever. You murdered my father. The words landed clean and final, and Aldrich stopped. You murdered him, Kyle said again, quieter, which was worse. And you looked me in the face at his funeral, and you helped me bury him, and you told me it was her... A pause that had terrible things in it. How many years did you intend to wait? Before you moved to remove me as well? Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Until the bond work became too much of a risk. Your mate bond was always going to be the problem. A bonded alpha is substantially harder to sunder. I needed the bond suppressed long enough to harvest your primary essence without triggering pack-wide response. His eyes moved to Seraphine. Her return accelerated the timeline. The bond is destabilizing. Another few months and your alpha bond would have been sufficiently weakened on its own. The mate bond reacted to this information with something that felt like rage. Not her rage, the mate bond's specific fierce objection to being weaponized, being discussed as a tool and a liability and a mechanism. Seraphine felt it in her sternum, felt it in the wolf that shared her body. I felt it move outward toward Cale the way heat moves toward cold, and she felt, for the first time, his wolf respond. Not controlled, not managed, a direct return signal, the bonded mate's answer. I'm here, I feel it too. Her focus nearly broke. Not now, she told every traitorous part of herself. Not now. Aldrich's hand moved toward the component table. Don't, Dara said from the staircase, blade raised. Aldrich's hand stopped. Step away from the table, Seraphine said, and then you're going to help me dismantle what you've built here without triggering the threshold reaction. Because if you activate this circle with 6 essences and no primary bond source, it's going to detonate in a 300-foot radius and everyone in this room dies, including you. Aldrich's eyes were calculating. See, you wouldn't know the disassembly sequence. I wrote the Conclave's ritual forensics protocol, she said. I know 17 disassembly sequences. I was hoping you'd make me use one so you couldn't claim later that the evidence was mishandled. She held out her hand. The activation key. Now. A long moment. Aldrich Vane, 63 years of patience and positioning and 3 generations of accumulated purpose, looked at her outstretched hand, and his composure came apart at last. Not dramatically, not with any performance, just quietly, like a structure whose last load-bearing point had finally given. He placed the activation key in her hand. She closed her fingers around it and breathed. The disassembly took 40 minutes. Precise, technical, requiring the kind of focused attention that left no room for the mate bond's increasingly urgent commentary or Cale's presence, radiating heat and barely managed emotion at the room's edge while Dara kept Aldrich contained. Seraphine worked through each sequence with the methodical care of someone who understood that accuracy was the difference between safe disassembly and a supernatural detonation that would take the North Ridge with it. She narrated each step for the recorder in her coat pocket, evidence preservation, conclave protocol, and she did not think about the man watching her from the corner. She did not think about what Aldrich had said. The bond is destabilizing. A bonded alpha is substantially harder to sunder. Another few months. She did not think about the fact that Kale's alpha bond had been degrading for 4 months, accelerating since her arrival, and that the conclave medical records he'd accessed without authorization suggested he hadn't told his own pack medical team the full extent of it. She did not think about what it meant that he'd been carrying that alone. When the last containment point was safely neutralized, she stood and pressed the evidence seal on the ritual circle's remains, recording the timestamp. "This site is under conclave jurisdiction," she said. Her voice came out level. "Aldrich Vane is to be transferred to conclave holding pending formal tribunal. Dara..." "I'll handle transport," Dara said. Seraphine walked to the stairs. Kyle followed her up into the morning air, and the cold of it hit her after the cellar's closeness like something clarifying. And she stood on the ridge's slope and breathed it, and tried to reassemble the architecture she needed between herself and everything she was currently feeling. "Seraphine." She turned. He was standing 2 feet away, which was closer than he'd been since she arrived, and he looked stripped, was the word. Stripped of the alpha's formal distance, of the deliberate management, of everything except the man underneath who had just spent 40 minutes watching her dismantle the mechanism that had been designed to kill him. "The bond," he said. "My alpha bond, it's..." He stopped. "I know," she said. "If we continue to suppress..." "I know. The medical assessment said 6 months, before the degradation becomes..." "Kyle." She said his name and watched him stop. "I know. I've known since I read your file. 3 months before I was assigned here." He absorbed this. "That's why you requested the assignment." She opened her mouth to give him the operational answer, the one she'd given him the first day, jurisdictional, evidentiary, clean. The mate bond chose this moment to stop being subtle entirely. It moved through her chest like a key turning in a lock that had been frozen for 5 years, like sensation returning to a limb that had been held at an unnatural angle, aching and insistent and undeniable. She closed her mouth. She looked at him, his face in the morning light, the blackened veins that mapped the damage of 5 years of both of them fighting something that did not want to be fought. And she made a calculation that had nothing to do with jurisdiction. "Partly," she said. Well, it was the most honest thing she'd said to him since she arrived. He exhaled, long, slow, the specific exhalation of a man releasing a thing he'd been holding at tension for a very long time. "What happens now?" he said. "Tribunal. Evidence submission. Your counsel gets restructured under conclave oversight." She paused. "Your alpha bond needs stabilization, which requires a conclave medical team and..." She held his gaze. "A decision. About the mate bond. About suppression. About what we do with the diagnostic reality of what we are to each other." "A decision we make together," he said. She studied him. "You don't make decisions with other people." "I'm aware that's been a problem." His voice was dry, but underneath the dryness was something unguarded. "I'm attempting to adjust. Despite everything, the cellar, the ritual circle, the 40 minutes of forensic precision, 5 years of accumulated damage." She felt something move in her that was dangerously close to humor. "That's a low bar," she said. "I know." A pause. "I'm starting there anyway." The ridge was quiet around them, pine and cold air and the distant sounds of the settlement waking into an ordinary morning that had no idea what had happened in the cellar beneath it. The mate bond settled. Not resolved, not concluded, but settled. The specific quieting of a thing that had been in distress and had received enough signal to reduce the urgency. She felt it in her sternum and in her wolf and in the way the cold air suddenly seemed less sharp. She turned toward the path back to the settlement. "Come on," she said. We have about 400 reports to file." He fell into step beside her. Their shoulders didn't touch, but neither of them created the deliberate space that they'd been maintaining since she arrived. It was a small thing. Small things were data. Chapter 5. The Conclave courier arrived at noon carrying a sealed document case with her name on it in the Northern Conclave's formal script. Restricted Series 7, the Voss lineage documentation, everything she'd spent 3 years gaining clearance to access. She signed for it in the hall's receiving area, acutely aware of the attention it generated from the wolves moving through the common space. Documents with conclave seals the color of deep amber were known, even by those without bureaucratic training, to carry legal weight, the kind that changed things. She took it to the records room and locked the door. The documentation was comprehensive. There's 60 pages of genealogical record, territorial bond anchor provenance, founding lineage legal analysis, and at the back, the piece she'd been waiting for, a formal conclave assessment, dated 18 months ago, concluding that the Voss bloodline's founding claim to Silvermore's territory was legally primary, predating the Dravenmore bond anchor by 40 years, and had been deliberately suppressed from official record by a party or parties within Silvermore's council administration. She sat with it for a long moment. She had known this. She had worked toward this for 3 years. The document in her hands was not a surprise. It was still heavy in a way that surprised her. Because the legal implications were precise, a primary founding claim, if formally asserted, would require a territorial bond anchor audit by the conclave. D. Cale's alpha bond, already damaged, already blackened at the edges, would be assessed against the primary claim. If the Voss claim was ruled superior, the Pack's bond anchor legitimacy would transfer. To her. She had come here for revenge, or told herself she had. The clean, operational version of revenge, legal vindication, record correction, the perpetrator identified and brought before a tribunal. The kind of revenge that looked like justice because it mostly was. She had not, until this moment, sitting with 60 pages of documentation that gave her exactly what she'd been working toward, fully reckoned with what it would cost. A knock at the records room door. She knew the rhythm. "Come in," she said. Cale entered with the particular energy of a man who had spent the last 3 hours in communications with the Conclave's Oversight Division and had not enjoyed the experience. He was carrying 2 cups of something, tea, black, the same as Dara had brought that morning, and he set one on the records table beside her without asking. She looked at the cup, then at him. "Dara told you," she said, "that you take it black, yes." "I was going to tell you about the documentation myself," she said. "I know." He sat across the table from her, wrapping both hands around his cup. The Conclave Oversight Officer mentioned the restricted series delivery. He paused. He was very careful about the phrasing. Documentation of significant territorial consequence. The way they talk when they're informing you of something they expect to be destabilizing. "It is destabilizing," she said. "Yes." She slid the document across the table. He picked it up. She watched him read, not all of it, the relevant pages, the assessment at the back. His face did what it did, which was very little on the surface and substantial amounts underneath. He set it down. "If you assert the claim," he said. "The bond anchor audit would begin within 30 days, she said. "The Conclave's assessment would likely rule in favor of the Voss lineage's primary status. Your alpha bond," she paused, "would be assessed for subordination or transfer." "I'd lose the Pack," he said. "You might." She held his gaze. "Or, the audit finds that the suppression of the founding documentation constitutes an externally imposed misalignment, Aldrich's interference, not a natural territorial precedence, and recommends a co-anchor resolution. Both bonds recognized. It's rare, but the Conclave has precedent for it in cases of deliberate record suppression." He was quiet for a moment. "That would require both parties to agree to the co-anchor structure." "Yes." "And to be in stable proximity for the bond anchor recalibration." "Yes." The implication of stable proximity sat between them with the patience of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. "There's a third option," he said. "You don't assert the claim. You take the evidence, the tribunal outcome, the name restoration, and leave." "That is the third option," she agreed. "It's not the option you came here for." She considered being precise about this. Operational, evidentiary, the Seraphine who had walked into his hall 4 days ago with documentation and professional distance and a suppression prescription that had stopped working. "No," she said, "it isn't." The records room was very quiet around them. All those shelves of old paper and cedar oil, all that accumulated territorial history that had been carefully managed and selectively edited and used as a weapon against both of them by a man who was now in conclave custody. "I owe you more than a tribunal outcome," Cale said. "I understand that the mathematics of what happened 5 years ago don't resolve with documentation and a perpetrator arrested. I understand that—" He stopped, set down his cup. "I was wrong. I was catastrophically wrong. And I was manipulated into it. But I was also—" His jaw tightened. "I wanted certainty. I had just lost my father and I wanted something to be certain, and Aldrich gave me certainty and I didn't—" He stopped again. "Question it," she said. "I didn't question it." "No." The mate bond moved between them, not urgent now, not the desperate frequency of suppressed instinct, but something quieter and more complicated. The bond learning to occupy a space that wasn't suppression or activation, but something in between, something adjacent to honesty. "I don't want your redemption arc," she said. It came out more direct than she'd planned. "I'm not here to watch you earn something back from me through sacrifice. I'm not a narrative resolution." She held his gaze. "I came back for my name and my standing, and because 6 wolves were dead and I knew what was killing them. And I stayed because the work required it." A pause. "And I'm still here because—" She stopped. He waited. He was very good at waiting, when he chose to use it for something other than avoidance. "Because the bond," she said. "Not just the bond. I want to be precise about this. The bond is a factor. It's always been a factor, but I have spent 5 years building a self that operates independently of it. And I'm not willing to let the existence of a fated mate bond be the entire explanation for anything I choose." He was watching her with the full, stripped-down attention. "So," she said, "I'm still here because I choose to be. Despite 5 years of evidence that this territory and this pack and you specifically have cost me things I can't fully recover." She held his gaze. "That's different from the bond pulling me back. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes," he said. "Then we can have a conversation about what comes next." The moment stretched between them, not the desperate tension of suppressed proximity, but the specific quality of 2 people deciding simultaneously to be in the same room with something true. The mate bond pulsed once, gently, as if in agreement. His hand moved across the table. He didn't reach for her. He turned his palm up on the table surface, an offer, a question, the gesture of a man who had decided to make himself readable and was prepared for it to be declined. She looked at his hand. She thought about all the architecture she'd built, all the years, the suppression prescription, the deliberate construction of a self that did not require him. She placed her hand in his. The mate bond responded like a held breath finally released, warmth and recognition and the specific sensation of 2 fractured halves of a connection carefully, tentatively beginning to re-establish communication. Not healed, not resolved, but no longer fighting itself. His hand closed around hers. Neither of them said anything. The records room held the quiet around them. The afternoon was documentation and communication and the dry machinery of legal process. Seraphine filing her incident report with the Conclave's Oversight Division, Dara coordinating Aldrich's transfer with the Northern Holding Facility, Cale in a series of communications with his council's surviving senior members that she could hear through the wall of the hall's administrative corridor as a steady, controlled rumble. At 3 in the afternoon, She was in the war table room cross-referencing the conclave's co-anchor precedent cases when a junior enforcer appeared in the doorway looking simultaneously apologetic and alarmed. "Emissary," he hesitated. We have a complication." "Describe the complication." "Aldrich Vane." He hesitated again. "He's requested to make a formal statement before transfer. Pack right. He's entitled to it under territorial law. Any pack member facing conclave transfer can address the Alpha and Assembled Council." He paused. "He's insisting on it. And he mentioned something about a contingency. Documentation he has. In a different location. He says if he's transferred without being heard, he'll invoke the contingency." Seraphine set down her records. There it is, she thought. 60 years of work. He wouldn't have come this far without something to fall back on. "Where is he now?" "The hall's holding chamber." "Tell him he'll be heard." She stood. "And find the Alpha." The hall's formal chamber felt different with Aldrich at its center. The tables arranged, the senior council members present along with Dara and 3 senior enforcers. Kyle stood at the head of the table. Seraphine took her position to the side, hand near the communicator in her coat, because she did not know what was about to happen, and she wanted the option. Aldrich Vane in holding restraints, but he still somehow managed to occupy space with the authority of a man conducting a meeting rather than facing a tribunal. "I have," he said, "a second set of documents, copies of the original Voss lineage suppression, including the authorization signatures." He paused. "Your father's signature is among them." The room went very quiet. Seraphine watched Cale's face, watched the specific stillness that fell over it. "The previous Alpha," Aldrich continued, "knew about the suppression. He didn't initiate it. That was my grandfather's work, but he chose not to correct it, not when he discovered it, because correcting it would have destabilized his claim." He held Cale's gaze. He was going to legitimize the Voss claim publicly, yes, but he was also going to negotiate its terms privately first, to protect your succession. A pause. He wasn't a villain, but he wasn't innocent. Seraphine absorbed this. The mate bond was quiet. She was quiet. "The documents are in Silvermore's Conclave Archive Annex," Aldrich said. "File Box 17. I want it on record that I am disclosing their location voluntarily." He looked at Seraphine. "Because if you're going to rebuild this pack correctly, you need the full record, not the curated version, not the version that makes the founding story clean." A pause. "I am not a good man, but I have always been thorough." He sat back. The room was very quiet. Seraphine looked at Kyle. He was looking at the table's surface, jaw working, processing the addition of his father's culpability to an accounting that was already full of damage. "Thank you," Seraphine said to Aldrich. Not warmth, precision. "Your cooperation is noted. It will be included in the tribunal record." She looked at the senior enforcers. "Transfer can proceed." They let him out. The room remained very still. "Kyle," she said, He stopped, stood. "I need a moment." "Take it," she said. He walked out of the chamber. She let him go. This was another small thing she was choosing, giving him space when she had once, 5 years ago, needed him to give her the same and he hadn't. Not because she owed him the mirror of her own experience, but because it was the right thing, and she had enough left to offer it. Dara appeared at her elbow. The contingency was real then. "The contingency was always real," Seraphine said. "He's been managing this for 60 years. A man like that doesn't go to a tribunal without a hand left to play." She paused. He played a less destructive card than I expected." "Why?" Seraphine considered this. The records room, the restricted series documentation, the moment Aldrich had placed the activation key in her palm without being physically compelled to. "I think," she said carefully, "that at the very end he wanted it finished. He wanted the record complete." A pause. "It doesn't make him less guilty of what he did, but it may be the only honest thing he's done in 60 years. Dara was quiet. Then, "What do we do with his father's signature on the suppression authorization?" "We add it to the full record," Seraphine said. The way he said, no curated version. She picked up her files. This pack's foundation has been built on selective memory. That ends here. She went to find Cale. He was on the hall's northern roof access, a flat stone platform that had probably served as a lookout once and now mostly served as a place to stand above everything and breathe. She'd found him here once before, years ago, during a pack crisis she barely remembered now, and she'd found it significant then that he came somewhere high and external when he needed to manage something large. She climbed up and stood beside him and looked out at Silvermoor. The settlement below, the forests beyond, the ridge with Aldrich's residence barely visible through the tree line, the quarry beyond that, the full breadth of the territory that was, legally, not yet fully anyone's in particular. He loved him, Kyle said. He wasn't looking at her. My father. He did love him, I think. Was in the way that people love people who are convenient to their existing narrative. My father's authority legitimized 60 years of council management, but it wasn't. He stopped. He wasn't purely instrumental. No, she said, which makes it worse, not better. Usually. He was quiet for a moment. My father knew the suppression existed and protected it to protect my succession. Yes. Which means my Alpha Bond's legitimacy problem isn't just Aldrich's crime. It has my family's complicity in it. Yes. And you've known this was likely, from the Conclave records. I suspected it, she said. I didn't have confirmation until this afternoon. He turned to look at her. And you still came. Still filed the claim. Still built the case. The case needed to be built on the full record, she said. I told you earlier, I know curated version. He looked at her for a long moment, the full, direct look, and the mate bond between them was very still, the specific stillness of something that had been in motion for days and had finally come to rest on solid ground. I'll support the co-anchor resolution, he said. Full conclave process, proper audit. Whatever the assessment finds, I won't contest it. Even if the ruling goes against you, she said. Even then, she held his gaze. That's the sacrifice I didn't ask you for. I know. A pause. It's not for you. It's because it's right. She looked at him for a long moment. You understand that if the assessment rules primary Voss claim, you'd be subordinating your bond anchor to mine. Functionally. Yes. That's a significant loss of, I know what it is. He held her gaze steadily. I know. The wind moved through the pine below, and Silvermoor's evening light made the settlement gold, and the mate bond settled between them like a third presence, patient, quiet, finally given enough room to breathe. All right, she said. It meant at least 4 things, and she let it mean all of them. Chapter 6, the Conclave's Bond Anchor Audit Team arrived at Silvermoor's border at 7 the following morning. 4 specialists in gray carrying equipment cases that clinked with the specific sound of calibration instruments, led by a senior assessor named Fenn, who had the compact efficiency of someone who had performed this process many times and felt no requirement to be gentle about it. Seraphine met them at the border. Fenn looked at her documentation, then at her face, then at the territory behind her. The site is prepared? The Ancestral Hall's bond chamber. Yes. The Alpha has been informed of the assessment parameters? He has. And the co-anchor petition is formally filed? Filed this morning. She held Fenn's gaze. I want to be clear that the primary claimant is requesting co-anchor resolution, not displacement. The petition specifies joint territorial legitimacy. Fenn's expression suggested that primary claimants requesting anything other than full displacement was unusual enough to be notable. That's your prerogative. The assessment will determine what the bond anchor supports. I understand. She turned toward the settlement. Follow me. The walk through Silvermoor felt different than it had 4 days ago. The stairs were still there. She didn't expect them to disappear overnight, but their quality had shifted. Shock had processed into something more complicated, less readable, the particular texture of a community reassembling its understanding of its own history. Wolves who had looked away 4 days ago met her eyes now. Not warmly, not with the ease of acceptance, but with the directness of people who had decided to stop performing. She appreciated the directness. It was something to work with. Kale was waiting at the ancestral hall's entrance with Dara and 2 council members, the surviving senior administrators, both of whom had spent yesterday afternoon in extensive conclave-supervised interviews regarding their knowledge of the suppressed documentation. Neither had known. The interviews had confirmed this. They were now occupying the specific position of people who had served an institution for decades and discovered it had been built on a foundation they hadn't examined. Kyle had dressed formally. Not the elaborate alpha regalia for pack ceremonies, but the precise, structured authority of formal conclave engagement. Dark wool, no ornamentation, the clean line of someone presenting themselves without theatrical supplement. She registered this as a choice and filed it. The bond anchor chamber was in the ancestral hall's foundations, older than the hall itself, stone that predated Silvermore's formal establishment, the specific compressed energy of a territorial bond anchor point, making the air in it feel slightly denser than elsewhere, like breathing at altitude. Seraphine had been in here twice before. Once at 16, i.e. during the founding rites ceremony that all pack members attended at majority. Once at 22, the night before her tribunal, when she'd come here alone because she'd needed to understand whether the territory itself recognized her, and it had. The bond anchor had responded to her bloodline's presence with a warmth that had no official category because no one had told it to. She stepped into the chamber now and felt it again. That warmth, the territory's specific recognition. Fenn's team set up their equipment with quiet efficiency. The assessment required both parties to stand at the chamber's center simultaneously. The bond anchor's response to their combined presence would form the basis of the audit's recommendation. "When you're ready," Fenn said. Seraphine moved to the chamber's center. Kyle moved to stand beside her. The proximity was the closest they'd been since the corridor outside the records room. 2 feet, then 1, then the specific distance of side by side, which the mate bond registered with a full frequency response that was, at this point, neither suppressed nor fully acknowledged but simply present. A fact. The way temperature was a fact. She felt the warmth of him at her shoulder, felt her wolf orient toward him with the automatic, unthinking attention of a compass. Fenn's team activated the assessment instruments. The bond anchor responded immediately. It came up through the floor, not physically, not literally, but as a wave of sensation that was bone-deep and territorial and very, very old. It moved through Seraphine first, and she felt it catalog her, the founding bloodline's signature against the anchor's memory. Oh, a recognition that had nothing to do with official documentation and everything to do with something that predated all of it. Then it moved through Kale. And this was not in any of the protocols she'd read, it moved through both of them simultaneously, the bond anchor apparently finding the mate bond between them and treating it as relevant data, running its assessment through the connection rather than around it. The sensation was extraordinary and deeply inconvenient. She felt him. Not emotionally, not interpretively, directly, the mate bond fully open for the first time since her arrival, since the suppression medication had stopped working, since the bond had been quietly building pressure against 5 years of deliberate blockage. She felt his wolf, enormous and controlled and exhausted from the effort of control, and carrying the damage of 4 months of alpha bond degradation with the specific quiet endurance of something that had decided that enduring was the only acceptable option. She felt his grief for his father. She felt the specific texture of his guilt about her exile. Not abstract guilt, not managed guilt, but the real thing, the kind that had been living in him without resolution for 5 years. She felt the moment he'd signed the banishment order, experienced it as he had experienced it, the sick certainty of a man who had decided that decisiveness was the same as correctness. It lasted approximately 4 seconds. Then the bond anchor completed its assessment, and the wave receded. Seraphine stood very still. Beside her, Kyle was breathing carefully. "Well," Fen said, in the tone of someone making a note. That's not a typical response pattern. What does it indicate? Seraphine said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of this. The bond anchor is treating both signatures as primary. Fen looked at his instruments, then at his colleagues, then back at the instruments with the expression of a professional whose equipment had just told him something outside the established parameters. Not co-primary in the subordination sense, co-primary in the founding sense. As if the anchor's original configuration required both. That's not possible, one of his colleagues said. The instruments suggest otherwise. Fen set down his calibration tool. Emissary Voss, is there anything in the restricted series documentation about the Voss founding bloodline's bond anchor configuration that would indicate dual anchor design? Seraphine said quietly. Fen stopped. Pardon? She had read it 3 months ago and filed it as historical footnote rather than operational relevance, because she had not imagined she would be standing in Silvermore's bond anchor chamber with Cale Dravenmore at her shoulder when the information became directly applicable. The Voss founding documents, she said, include a passage on the original territorial bond anchor's design. 60 years before the Dravenmore line established their claim, the founding anchor was structured for dual occupancy, the Voss line's founding alpha and her bonded mate. She paused. The mate was from the Dravenmore family's ancestral line, 4 generations back. The chamber was extremely quiet. The Dravenmore bond anchor claim isn't a usurpation, Kyle said slowly. The quality of his voice had changed, something unraveling in it, not painfully but with the specific texture of a misunderstanding releasing its hold. It's the other half. The anchor was built for both, Seraphine said. Aldrich's grandfather found the secondary documentation, the Voss line's primary status, and used it to delegitimize the Dravenmore claim. But he read it wrong, or chose to read it wrong. The primary status doesn't mean sole ownership. It means the Voss bloodline holds the anchor's founding key. She paused. The Dravenmore line holds the lock. Fen looked between them with the expression of a man recalibrating substantially. This would mean the current configuration, an alpha bond without the Voss founding key, has been structurally incomplete since the suppression. For 60 years, Seraphine confirmed. Which would account, Fen's colleague said carefully, for the alpha bond's degradation. Without the founding key, the anchor is running on half its original structure, Kyle said. He was looking at Seraphine. My father's bond degraded too. The medical records, the conclave attributed it to age and pack stress, but he deteriorated quickly. A pause. Earlier than he should have. The anchor was incomplete, Seraphine said. It's been incomplete since the suppression. Every alpha bond built on it since has been unsupported, Fen said. He sounded genuinely affected, which was outside her assessment of his range. Alpha Dravenmore. The degradation you're currently experiencing isn't the result of bond suppression alone. It's the anchor itself, destabilizing from the incompleteness. The blackened veins at Cale's jaw pulsed once in the chamber's dense air. What's the remediation? Seraphine said, crisply, because she needed someone to be focused on logistics right now, and Cale was processing something that required more than logistics. Bond anchor recalibration, Fen said. The co-anchor petition covers this. Both parties formally recognized, the founding key restored to active status, the Dravenmore bond reintegrated with the complete anchor structure. He paused. The process requires close proximity, prolonged. The anchor needs to read both signatures in combination for an extended period before it accepts the recalibration. How prolonged? She said. Fen consulted his instruments with the studied neutrality of a professional delivering information he suspected might be personally complicated for the people receiving it. Based on the current degradation level, a minimum of several hours, the mate bond's presence will facilitate it significantly. He paused. If the mate bond is in an open rather than suppressed state. The chamber received this information. I see, Seraphine said. She did not look at Cale. She was aware that not looking at him was its own kind of statement. "We'll need the space prepared," she said, "and I'll need access to the restricted series documentation to confirm the recalibration protocol." She kept her voice in its operational register. "Give us an hour." Fen nodded and withdrew with his team with efficient tact. The chamber was very quiet with just the two of them in it. "You could have told me," Kyle said. "I didn't know this specific configuration until 30 seconds ago," she said. "Not this, the degradation, when you received my medical file." He turned to look at her. "You knew my alpha bond was failing. You knew the timeline." "Yes. And you filed for this assignment 3 months ago with that knowledge." "Yes. Seraphine." Her name in his mouth. With that specific register again, the one that bypassed everything and landed directly. "Why didn't you just tell me? You could have sent the documentation, filed the petition remotely. You didn't have to—" "I know," she said. The admission sat between them, plain and undefended. "I needed to be here," she said. "I needed to see it. I needed to know whether the person I remembered was worth the recalibration, whether this territory was worth coming back to." She held his gaze. "And whether you were someone who could accept what the full record contained without—" She stopped. "Without breaking," he said. "Without running from it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Am I?" She looked at him. The specific question, asked without deflection, with the vulnerability of a man who wasn't certain of his own answer and had decided to be honest about the uncertainty. "So far," she said. His jaw moved. "That's a low bar." "You said something similar about adjusting earlier." She held his gaze. "I'm starting there too." The bond anchor hummed around them, patient and old and structurally incomplete in a way it had been for 60 years. Waiting for exactly this combination. The documentation review took 40 minutes. Seraphine spread the restricted series founding records across the bond chamber's preparation table with Fen's team lead. A quiet woman named Oris, who specialized in historical bond architecture and made small, excited sounds at several points that she clearly tried to suppress, and confirmed the recalibration protocol. It was straightforward. Technically, the anchor required continuous dual presence, the founding key and the inherited bond in proximity, while Fen's team ran the calibration instruments. The mate bond's open state would provide the connection the anchor needed to rebuild its incomplete structure. What it required from Seraphine and Kale, practically, she was several hours sitting in the same enclosed space with the mate bond in a non-suppressed state. She had managed larger things. She kept telling herself this. "There's one complication," Oris said, near the end of the documentation review, in the specific apologetic tone of someone who had been looking for a way to mention something and decided to stop looking for a better moment. Seraphine looked at her. "The recalibration protocol in the original founding documents—" Oris indicated a passage that Seraphine had read and moved past as theoretical. "It specifies that the anchor responds to the founding key's active designation, not passive bloodline presence." She paused. "The Voss founding documents use specific language. The founding key must be willingly claimed, not just present." "Meaning," Seraphine said, "deep meaning you need to formally assert the co-anchor claim, vocally, in the chamber." Oris's expression was carefully professional. "The anchor is designed to respond to intention, not just lineage. The founding alpha built that in deliberately, presumably to prevent the claim from being activated involuntarily or posthumously." Seraphine considered this. "I have to say it. Yes, aloud, in the presence of the secondary anchor holder." A pause. "There's traditional language in the founding documents, but any clear declaration of intention to hold the anchor jointly should satisfy the requirement." Seraphine looked at the passage, read it twice. Then she went to find Kyle. He was in the corridor outside the chamber, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, looking at the floor with the specific, focused attention of a man thinking very hard about something he hadn't resolved. He looked up when she approached. "There's a requirement," she said, "for the recalibration." She told him what Oris had told her. He listened. His expression moved through several things. "You have to claim the anchor," he said. "Willingly, out loud. In the chamber, in your presence." She held his gaze. "The founding records describe it as the key acknowledging the lock, and the lock acknowledging the key. A mutual declaration." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't plan for this specific requirement." "No, but you're going to do it." She looked at him steadily. "I came back for the full record, no curated version." She paused. "This is part of the full record." Something shifted in his face, not the alpha expression, not the managed professional distance, but the specific, unguarded quality of a man who had been waiting for something without knowing what shape it would take when it arrived. "Then let's do it," he said. The chamber received them both again. Fenn's team positioned at the edges with instruments running, Oris with the founding documents, Dara standing at the entrance because Seraphine had asked her to be a witness, and Kyle had agreed without question. The bond anchor's warmth came up immediately this time, recognizing both of them, the incompleteness in it more apparent now that she understood what she was feeling. They stood at the center. Kyle looked at her. She looked at him. The mate bond between them had been in its non-suppressed state for the better part of a day now, and she had grown accustomed to its presence the way you grew accustomed to a sound you'd been trying not to hear, with the specific relief of stopping the effort. She could feel him. Not intrusively, not overwhelmingly, but as a steady signal, a presence in the peripheral sense that shared her awareness with the chamber's warmth and Oris's quiet note-taking and the distant sounds of Silvermore's evening outside the stone walls. She drew a breath. "I, Seraphine Voss," she said, and her voice in the chamber had a resonance that ordinary speech didn't carry. The bond anchor picking up the founding key's frequency and beginning to amplify it. "Of the founding bloodline of this territory, claim the co-anchor of Silvermore's bond seat, willingly, with full knowledge of the record, complete and uncurated." She paused. "I claim it jointly, not in displacement, in completion." The warmth in the chamber intensified. Kale spoke without prompting. His voice was low and direct and carried the same resonance, the anchor recognizing the secondary holder responding to the key. "I, Kale Dravenmore, Alpha of Silvermore, acknowledge the founding key. I acknowledge the lock was always incomplete." A pause, brief, the pause of a man choosing his words with care. "I acknowledge what was taken from both of us by the suppression of this record, and I hold the anchor in joint claim, for the territory, for the pack." His eyes held hers. "Willingly." The bond anchor's response was not subtle. The warmth became something with weight and direction, moving through the floor, through the walls, outward through the territory in a wave that Seraphine would later learn was felt by every wolf in Silvermore simultaneously. A tremor in their bond sense that most of them would describe as the territory exhaling after a very long-held breath. In the chamber, it felt like something structural being completed, like a sentence that had been missing its last word for 60 years finally finding it. The blackened veins at Kale's jaw. She watched them, because she'd been watching them since she arrived as a measure of everything the incomplete anchor had been costing him, began, slowly, to lighten. Fenn made a sound of professional satisfaction. "The recalibration is holding," he said. "We'll need the extended proximity period to complete the process, but the anchor has accepted the dual claim." Seraphine breathed. Beside her, Kale's shoulder was against hers, not arranged, not deliberate, the natural result of standing side by side in a space that had just become the most honest room in Silvermore. She didn't move away. Neither did he. Chapter 7. The extended proximity requirement meant the bond chamber for 4 hours, Fenn's instruments running continuous calibration, Oris taking notes at a speed that suggested she intended to write several papers on the founding anchor documentation before the year was out, the warmth of the recalibrating bond anchor making the enclosed space feel less like a basement and more like something that had decided to take care of the people inside it. Seraphine sat on the chamber's stone bench with the restricted series documentation in her lap and read, because sitting still without a task was not something she had practiced. Kyle sat beside her, close enough for the anchor's reading, the proximity requirement precise about what close meant, and did not pretend to have documents he needed to study. He sat and he was present in the unguarded way she was learning was actually his natural state when he wasn't performing authority for an audience. She found this destabilizing. She was working on being honest with herself about this. "Tell me about the conclave," he said after the first hour. She looked at him. 5 years, he said. "Tell me what they were." It was not a small request. She looked at the founding documents in her lap and considered what she had been in those 5 years. The raw, a furious thing that had arrived at the Northern Conclave's intake facility with a Silvermore exile seal and nothing else, and what she had become by the time she'd risen to third-seat emissary with a restricted archive clearance and a sundering right forensic specialization. The first 6 months were bad, she said. The flatness of the statement was its own kind of honesty. The Conclave's intake process for exiled wolves is efficient, not gentle. They assess capability and assign placement based on what you can do rather than what you are, which I found, she paused, clarifying. No one cared about my pack rank or my status or my founding bloodline. They cared that I could track a ritual signature in a contaminated site in under 20 minutes. "You were always good at that," he said. She looked at him. "You remember that. You tracked the border marker disruption during the spring territorial survey. You were 19. The survey team had been searching for 2 days. He held her gaze. "I remember most things. I want to be clear about that." The mate bond registered the statement with quiet warmth. She catalogued it and kept going. "The conclave gave me work," she said. "That was the right thing for me at the time, whether they intended it as therapy or simply as resource allocation. I worked, I specialized, I built—" She looked at the documentation. "A case, for 3 years before I was cleared for the restricted series. Building a case was something to do with the anger. When did the anger become something else?" She thought about this honestly. "When I had enough of the record to understand the full shape of what happened. Not just what Aldrich did, what everyone did, what your father did, what you did." She paused. "What I did." He was very still. "What did you do?" "I was 22 and certain I was right about everything," she said. "I was competent, and I had a founding bloodline claim that I didn't fully understand, and I moved through this pack like I was entitled to something I hadn't named yet." She held his gaze. "Aldrich was afraid of me for reasons that were real, even if his response to that fear was monstrous. I was a variable in a system he'd spent 60 years managing. That doesn't justify what he did, but understanding why someone is afraid of you is different from being innocent." Kyle was quiet for a moment. "You were 22. "Yes. You didn't know." "No," she paused. "But I wasn't as straightforward as I've been telling myself I was. That's part of the full record, too." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been telling myself a version of events as well. I know. That I had no choice. That the evidence was overwhelming. That any alpha would have done the same." He held her gaze. "The more accurate version is that I knew you. I knew how you moved through the world. And I chose certainty over knowing you, because knowing you was—" He stopped. "Complicated," she said. "Terrifying," he said. "More accurate." The words sat between them, plain and undefended. She had not expected that. She had built a comprehensive architecture for managing Cale Dravenmore's emotional range based on 5 years of memory and 2 years of intelligence reports and 4 days of direct re-engagement. And terrifying. I delivered that flatly, with that directness, had not been in any of the models. "You were afraid of me," she said. "I was 27 and newly alpha, and you were the most—" He stopped again, made a decision. "You walked into rooms like they had been waiting for you specifically. You argued with council members twice your age on territorial law, and you were right and you knew it. You trained better than wolves 3 ranks above you, and you didn't perform modesty about it." He met her eyes. "And then the bond activated, and I understood that the most formidable person in my pack was—" He paused. "Mine, in the mate bond sense, and I had no idea what to do with that." She sat with this for a moment. "So when Aldrich gave you a reason," she said. "I took it," he said. "I am not offering that as mitigation. I want to be clear about that. It is not mitigation. It is the honest thing that is worse than the version where I was simply deceived." The chamber was very quiet. "I know," she said. "I know you know." His jaw moved. "I needed to say it without you having to ask." She looked at him. The specific look that had been developing over the past 4 days, the one that wasn't evaluation or interrogation or the careful assessment of a person in hostile territory, but something that occupied the space where those things had been standing before they moved. "What would you have done," she said, "if I'd asserted the claim rather than petitioned for co-anchor?" He answered without hesitation. "Supported it. Conclave process. Full cooperation. Even displacement. Even then." She held his gaze. "I know," she said. "You sound surprised." "I'm updating my model," she said. "Oh, it takes a moment." Something moved in his face that was, against all reasonable expectation, humor. The specific kind that lived in people who didn't perform it, that appeared without announcement and disappeared the same way. "Take the time you need," he said. She did. The bond anchor hummed around them, steady and progressively more complete, and the mate bond between them occupied its non-suppressed space with the quiet of something that had been given room to exist and was choosing, for the moment, to simply do that. At some point in the 3rd hour, without ceremony, she set the founding documents aside. They sat without the intermediary of task between them, 2 people in a stone room that was relearning what it was built to hold, the territory's warmth moving through the floor and through them, the instruments ticking at the room's edges. "When the audit is concluded," she said, "and the tribunal is scheduled, and the conclave closes the investigation formally," she paused. "What does the pack need?" He considered this. Honesty, about the record, about what the council suppression did to the pack's bond structure. The degradation hasn't just been in the alpha bond. Lower-ranking members have been experiencing bond instability for years that was attributed to standard variation. His jaw tightened. It was the anchor, incomplete, affecting the entire pack's bond health. "I know," she said. "I saw the medical reports. They need the explanation, and they need it plainly, not managed." He paused. "And they need to see—" He stopped. "The co-anchor," she said. Yes, publicly, if you're willing." She thought about this, the specific weight of it, standing in front of a pack that had exiled her and showing them the anchor recalibrated, the founding key acknowledged, the record corrected in real and visible terms. The version of this that was a performance, and the version of this that was simply true. "I'm willing," she said, "if the pack is given the full record first, not after, before, so that what they see is a response to truth rather than a presentation of outcome." "Agreed," he said. Immediately. No deliberation. She looked at him. "I told you," he said. "I'm adjusting." "You are," she said. The 4th hour passed in a companionable quiet that neither of them remarked upon, because remarking upon it would have required acknowledging that companionable quiet between them was something that existed, and they were both proceeding at whatever pace the honesty could sustain without breaking. When Fen announced that the recalibration had achieved stable threshold and the extended proximity requirement was satisfied, the blackened veins at Kyle's jaw were barely visible, pale gray where they had been deep charcoal, retreating toward his collar. He looked, she thought, like a man who had set down something very heavy after a very long walk. She understood the feeling. Chapter 8. The second contingency arrived at midnight. A message, routed through Conclave Holding from Aldrich Vane, addressed to Seraphine specifically, and marked with the Conclave's evidence preservation tag that meant it had been screened for threats and cleared for delivery. Inside, a single folded page with a location, a description, and 12 words. There is a seventh essence, harvested before the others. It isn't from the pack. She read it twice in the lamplight of her quarters. Then she picked up the Conclave communicator. "Kyle," she kept her voice even. "Read this." She photographed the note and transmitted it. 10 seconds of silence. Then, "Where are you?" "My quarters." "Stay there." "I'm not going to stay there." A brief pause. "I know. I'm coming to you." He arrived in 4 minutes, which was faster than the route from the Alpha's quarters should have allowed, and she decided not to examine what that implied about his pace. He read the note physically. She'd printed the photograph, and then looked at her. "A seventh essence," he said, "harvested before the pattern began, not from the pack." "Which means it wasn't part of the Sundering Rites threshold count," she said. "It was pre-existing, already in the ritual infrastructure when he built the rest around it." She looked at the location Aldrich had described, the cellar beneath the ancestral hall's original foundation stones, a space she hadn't known existed and suspected most of Silvermore's current residents didn't either. "It's a primary bond essence." Kyle was very still. If he had a primary bond essence already, he didn't need yours specifically. He needed an Alpha's primary bond, and he'd already harvested it from somewhere else. She held his gaze. "Oh, the question is when and from whom." "My father," Kyle said. The word landed the way it had been landing all day, with the specific weight of a thing that kept finding new angles. "The night he was killed," Seraphine said, "Aldrich performed the original ritual, but not the full sundering, just the harvest. One primary bond essence from the Alpha of record at the time." She paused. "He's been keeping it for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to build the rest." "He was always going to do this," Kyle said. "This was never about me specifically or you specifically. He needed us both out of the way so he could use the seventh essence, his clean, untraceable primary bond harvest, to complete the rite with pack-level precision." "Without the seventh," she said, "the rite targets the current Alpha bondholder. With it, the rite targets the anchor itself, the whole structure." She looked at him. "If he'd succeeded, the recalibration we completed today would have been impossible. The anchor would have been destroyed at its foundation." Kyle looked at the location Aldrich had provided. "He's giving us the contingency himself." "Because we already caught him," she said. "The tribunal happens regardless, but the seventh essence is still down there, and a primary bond essence in a ritual container doesn't become inert when its collector is arrested. Without formal conclave dismantling," she paused, "it's still active, still dangerous. Who knows how to dismantle it?" She held his gaze. "I do." A beat. "The same way you dismantled the other circle," he said. "Similar protocol." "Oh, the seventh essence complicates it because it's a primary bond source. The dismantling sequence has to account for the alpha bond frequency specifically. The ritual container will respond to alpha proximity." She paused. "I'll need you in the chamber while I work." "That's why Aldrich sent it to you directly," Kyle said. "He knew it would require both of us." "Probably," she said. "I'm choosing to interpret this as a final act of useful thoroughness rather than a trap." "Optimistic." "Operational," she said. "We go in assuming it's legitimate and we prepare for it not being. Dara—" "I'll tell Dara to hold the entrance," he said. "Fenn's team is still on site. One of his specialists should be present for evidence documentation." "Get Oris," she said. "She'll understand the founding anchor implications of the seventh essence better than the others." He was already reaching for the communicator. The cellar beneath the ancestral hall's original foundation stones was accessed through a panel in the bond chamber floor, visible, if you knew to look, as a slight irregularity in the stonework, a seam that was too regular to be natural. The panel lifted on a hinge that had been maintained. Recently, the mechanism oiled, no resistance. Aldrich had been using this space. The stairs were narrower than the northern residence cellar, older, the stone walls close enough to be claustrophobic. The lamp Kale carried threw their shadows long ahead of them as they descended. The chamber below was small, 12 feet across, a barely enough clearance for the three of them plus Oris, and its smell was different from what Seraphine had expected. Not the sweet rot of harvested essence she'd encountered at the northern residence. Something older, drier, the smell of something that had been sealed and contained for a very long time. In the chamber's center was a ritual container, a stone vessel the size of a large book, covered in a script she recognized as pre-conclave binding notation. Inside, she knew without opening it, was the harvested primary bond essence of the previous alpha of Silvermore, Kyle's father. She looked at him. He was looking at the vessel with an expression that had moved past the alpha's control into something that was simply the face of a man confronting one of the specific physical remains of his father's murder kept in a basement for 20 years. "You don't have to stay close while I work," she said, quietly. "I need to," he said. "You said the sequence requires alpha bond proximity." "It does, but I can work the outer boundary. You don't have to—" "Seraphine." He looked at her. "I'm all right." He wasn't, entirely. She could feel it through the mate bond, not devastation, not collapse, but the steady weight of something that had been carried and was being carried still, with the particular endurance of a person who had decided that enduring was what they had to offer. She felt it, and she let him see that she felt it, and she didn't offer him a way out of the room. This was its own kind of respect. She hoped he understood it that way. "Starting with the outer binding," she said, and turned to the vessel. The disassembly took longer than the northern residence's ritual circle. The binding notation was archaic and precise, designed by someone who had known what they were doing 60 years ago and had built in redundancies. She worked through each layer with Oris reading the founding documents over her shoulder for reference, the two of them building the sequencing in real time, Kale's presence at the chamber's edge providing the alpha bond frequency, the outer binding used as its authentication layer. She was in the 7th sequence when the vessel responded. It recognized Kale, and not as a threat, as a resonance. The primary bond essence inside it registering the alpha bond frequency of the current holder and responding to the genetic familiarity, the specific way that blood lineages carried bond frequency signatures across generations. The vessel warmed, glowed faintly at its seams, and then, because the founding anchor recalibration was still active and the mate bond was open and the chamber was below the bond anchor chamber itself, the territory responded. The warmth came up through the floor again, not the bond anchor's assessment this time, something more specific, more directed. The territory's response to the primary essence of one of its former alpha holders coming back into proximity with the current holder's bond frequency. An acknowledgement. The land itself, doing what land did when it remembered. An Oris made a very quiet sound beside her. Seraphine kept working. Her hands were steady. Her focus was steady. The mate bond was steady. Kale's signal in her peripheral sense, not intruding, simply present, the way the chamber's warmth was present, the way the old stone was present. She completed the final sequence. The binding notation on the vessel's surface went dark. She placed her hands on either side of the stone and said, in the pre-conclave binding language that the restricted series had taught her, the dismantling declaration. The vessel's warmth faded. The glow at its seams extinguished. The chamber was quiet. She sealed the vessel with evidence preservation compound and handed it to Oris. She stood. Kyle was looking at her. In the lamp's light in the small stone room, with the mate bond between them open and the anchor complete above them and the territory's acknowledgement still fading from the floor. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he crossed the chamber, not quickly, not with the careful deliberateness of someone managing their own movement, but with the directness of a man who had stopped calculating the distance and closed it. He stopped in front of her. Close, closer than the anchor's proximity requirement, closer than operational necessity, the specific distance of a choice. She looked at him, looked up at him, which was not a physical experience she had much practice with. And the mate bond between them was completely, quietly, devastatingly present. And she was not suppressing it, and he was not suppressing it, and the stone room around them was holding all of it without comment. "Seraphine," he said, her name in his mouth, in that register. "I want to—" He stopped, started again, more honestly. "I want to ask if I can—" "Yes," she said. He raised his hand and placed it against the side of her face with the specific, careful deliberateness of a man who understood that careful deliberateness was required. And she felt it through the mate bond and through her own skin simultaneously, the warmth of his palm, and she felt his wolf, and she felt her wolf, and she felt the anchor above them and the territory around them, and all 60 years of incomplete structure finally having what it had been built to hold. She placed her hand over his. They stayed like that. Wait in the small stone room below the ancestral hall, with Oris very quietly pretending to read documentation on the far side of the chamber until the lamp between them guttered once and held. Chapter 9. The tribunal convened at 9 in the morning in Silvermore's formal hall, the largest interior space in the settlement, built for pack-wide gatherings, capable of holding the entire adult population in its tiered seating. The conclave had sent a formal tribunal panel, 3 assessors in deep gray, the senior among them a woman named Cassia, who had the specific quality of absolute judicial stillness that came from decades of presiding over proceedings where the stakes were genuinely consequential. Seraphine had testified before Cassia once before. She had been on the wrong side of the bench that time. She sat at the witness table now with her documentation in front of her and her hands folded and the mate bond a quiet, steady signal at the edge of her awareness. And she watched the hall fill. All of Silvermore had come. She had expected some. She had not expected all. Had not expected the families of the 6 victims in the front rows, the children who had been kept out of common areas for the past 3 days, now sitting straight-backed beside parents who were trying to explain what a tribunal was, the elderly wolves who had been pack members under the previous alpha and who watched the proceedings begin with the careful attention of people cross-referencing what was happening against what they remembered. She had not expected, in the 3rd row from the front, the woman who had looked away from her on the first morning. She was looking at Seraphine directly now, her child on her lap, expression calibrated to something that might eventually become acknowledgement if it was given enough time. Seraphine held her gaze briefly, then looked forward. Aldrich Vane was escorted in by 2 conclave holding officers and seated at the defendant's table without ceremony. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made his decision and was living inside it, not at peace, but finished with the particular exhaustion of sustained deception. He did not look at Kyle. He did not look at Seraphine. He folded his hands on the table and looked at Cassia, and his posture was still somehow the posture of a man who had occupied institutional authority for a long time. Kyle sat at the alpha's seat to the hall's left, formal still, whilst the black of his ceremonial coat making the receding gray of the veins at his jaw visible in the hall's morning light. He had not told the pack about the degradation. That would be part of today. Cassia opened the tribunal without preamble. Seraphine gave her testimony first. She had given testimony before in formal conclave settings, affidavits, witness statements, investigative reports, and she was efficient about it, building the evidentiary structure from the forensic evidence outward, the ritual signature, the body site pattern, the spiral's convergence, the northern residence cellar, the records room alteration, the margin notation, the session log gap, the administrator's own declaration of the 7th essence's location. She did not editorialize. She did not deliver it as a story. She presented it as a record. Because records were what lasted, and what she was building today needed to last. Aldrich's formal statement followed hers. It was, as she had anticipated, knowing the shape of the man, comprehensive. He admitted to the murder of the previous alpha. He admitted to the ritual evidence configuration that had framed Seraphine. He admitted to the 6 subsequent murders and the sundering rites construction. He provided the full methodology without prompting, which the tribunal panel received with varying degrees of visible discomfort, not because it was disturbing, which it was, but because the specificity of it indicated a mind that had been doing this deliberately and without obvious internal disruption for 60 years. He admitted last to the deliberate suppression of the founding bloodline documentation. "My grandfather made this choice," he said. "My father maintained it. I maintained it." He paused. "We believed the Dravenmore succession represented a diminishment of this territory's founding purpose. We were wrong about a great many things. We were not wrong about our commitment to this pack's long-term welfare." He looked at Cassia. "I understand those are not mitigating factors. I offer them as context." "Context is noted," Cassia said. "I also want to note," Aldrich said, "for the record, that the Voss-Dravenmore co-anchor configuration is the correct resolution. The founding documents support it. The territory supports it. I opposed it because I opposed its specific occupants. That opposition was personal and wrong." The hall was very quiet. Seraphine did not look at him. She looked at her documentation. "Thank you." "Councilman Vane," Cassia said, "the tribunal will recess for deliberation." The recess lasted 40 minutes. Seraphine spent it in the hall's side corridor with Dara and a cup of tea that she didn't drink, running through the documentation she intended to present to the pack after the tribunal's conclusion. The full record. No curated version. She had prepared it carefully. Not a speech, not a narrative with heroes and villains clearly labeled, but a factual account of what the founding documents showed, what Aldrich's suppression had done to the pack's bond structure, and what the co-anchor recalibration meant for Silvermore's bond health going forward. She had written it and rewritten it until the parts that were about her were as plainly stated as the parts that were about anyone else. Because the full record included her role in it, and she had promised herself she wasn't going to manage the telling. Cale found her in the corridor 10 minutes before the recess concluded. He stood beside her against the wall and said nothing for a moment. The comfortable nothing. The silence that had been developing between them over the past 4 days with the organic patience of something that had decided to take the space it needed rather than fill it artificially. "After the verdict," he said. "The address." "Yes." "Together," he said. She looked at him. "You want to present it together." "The record affects both of us. The pack should hear it from both of us." He met her gaze. "If you're willing." She thought about it. The specific weight of standing in front of Silvermore's full population beside him, presenting the corrected record, the co-anchor, the 5 years of exile and the founding claim and all of it, together. The version of this that was a performance of unity and the version that was simply true. "I'm willing," she said. The tribunal bell rang. They walked back in together, and she did not think about what the pack read into this, and she suspected he didn't either, and she suspected they were both slightly wrong about that. Cassia's verdict was delivered in the flat, precise language of formal conclave judgment. Aldrich Vane, guilty on 7 counts of ritual murder, 1 count of deliberate record suppression constituting territorial fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit bond destruction at pack level. Transferred to conclave permanent holding, with the pack's right to formally address the territorial harm through conclave restitution proceedings. The hall received it in silence. Not shock. The testimony had been thorough, and the evidence was not ambiguous. A different kind of silence, the specific quality of a community processing the confirmation of something it had partially known and partially refused to know, and now had no choice but to hold in full daylight. Cassia concluded the formal proceedings. Then she looked at Seraphine. "The tribunal notes," she said, "that the conviction on all counts constitutes a formal exoneration of the prior conviction recorded against Seraphine Voss in the matter of the death of the previous Alpha of Silvermore. That conviction is vacated, effective immediately. The exile seal is dissolved. The record is corrected." The hall was very quiet. Seraphine sat with it. She had known this was coming. She had built 3 years of work toward this specific moment. She had thought about it in conclave archive rooms at 2 in the morning, in transit between assignments, in the specific insomnia that came from being a person who had been told by official record that she was something she was not. She had expected it to feel like something arriving. Instead, it felt like something being set down. A weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing the carrying of it, and now it was on the floor, and her body was adjusting to the absence. Her throat tightened once, briefly. She held it. "Thank you," she said to Cassia. Her voice was steady. She stood. Kyle stood beside her. They walked to the hall's front together. The hall's full attention was the specific quality of several hundred people deciding simultaneously to be present. She had spoken to large groups before, conclave briefings, investigation assemblies, training cohorts, and she understood the texture of collective attention, the way a room could either be with you or watching you, and the difference mattered. This room was with her. She hadn't expected that. She registered it and adjusted. "I'm going to tell you what happened," she said. "The complete account, not the version that makes this territory's founding story clean, and not the version that assigns simple blame to a single person and closes the accounting there." She looked out at the hall. The families in the front rows, the council members at the sides, the children, the elderly, the wolves who had been here for all of it, and the wolves who had arrived after. "You deserve the full record. That's what you're going to hear," she told them. She started with the founding documents, the Voss Dravenmore dual anchor design, 60 years before Aldrich's grandfather's intervention. She explained the suppression, what it had done structurally to the pack's bond health over generations, why the bond instability that had been attributed to standard variation was in fact the anchor running on half its designed capacity. She told them about the previous Alpha's knowledge, that he had discovered the suppression and chosen to negotiate its correction rather than expose it immediately, a choice made from the same impulse toward managed certainty that ran through this territory's history like a seam. She told them about herself, her founding bloodline status, its legal implications, what it meant for the territory's bond anchor claim. She told them about the 5 years of exile in terms that were factual rather than wounded. What she had done, what she had built, why she had come back, and what she had been prepared to do when she arrived. Then she stopped. Kale stepped forward. He spoke without notes and without the Alpha's formal register, in the plain voice, the one she'd been cataloging since the first day, the one that lived underneath the function. "I signed the exile order," he said. "I had been Alpha for 4 days. I was presented with evidence and testimony that I did not question as thoroughly as I should have by a man I trusted in a moment when I needed someone to trust." He paused. "Those are explanations. They are not excuses. The consequence of my failure to question was 5 years of unjust exile for a member of this pack who had done nothing to deserve it." He looked out at the hall. "I can't return those years. I can tell you honestly what happened and what the correct record is, and what I intend to do about it." He told them about the co-anchor, what the recalibration meant, what the bond anchor's complete configuration meant for the pack's bond health going forward. He told them that the blackened veins they'd been noticing at his jaw for months were the result of an incomplete anchor and were resolving. He told them that the co-anchor structure was correct, not a compromise, not a political resolution, but the founding design, the thing the territory had been built for. "The pack's bond health will stabilize," he said. "It will take time."
"The anchor has been running incomplete for 60 years, and the repair is not instantaneous. But it is complete, and you will feel the difference." He stopped. The hall was quiet for a long moment. Then the woman in the 3rd row, the one who had looked away and then looked back, raised her hand. An old pack meeting gesture, the request to speak at formal assembly. Cassia, still at the tribunal bench, acknowledged it with a nod. The woman stood. She was perhaps 40, solid, with the specific presence of someone who had been in a pack long enough to understand what it meant and to take its obligations seriously. "I want to ask the emissary," she said. "After everything, why co-anchor? Why stay?" The hall listened.
Seraphine looked at her. The direct look, the one that didn't manage. "Because the Pack's bond structure needed its founding key," she said. "And because the full record deserves a complete resolution, not a partial one." She paused. "And because this is my territory." She held the woman's gaze. "I was born here. It recognized me the night I came back, before any document was filed or any declaration made. That recognition doesn't require anyone's authorization." A beat. "It's mine," she said. "I'm claiming it. All of it." The hall absorbed this. The woman nodded. Not warmly, not with the ease of instant conversion, but with the directness of someone who had received an honest answer to an honest question and was prepared to work with it. She sat down. Several more hands. Seraphine and Cale answered them in turn, some practical, some challenging, with some from the families of the victims asking questions about the tribunal's restitution proceedings that deserved specific answers and received them. They answered together and separately, dividing the questions by expertise without discussion, the rhythm of it developing with the organic ease of two people who had spent 4 days working in close coordination and had stopped needing to negotiate the handoffs. At some point, she became aware that the room had noticed this. She made no adjustment. Neither did Cale. The hall took an hour to clear. People moved through in clusters, conversations spilling from the formal tiers into the common space outside, the specific social processing of a community metabolizing a large amount of new information. Dara coordinated the families of the victims with the conclave restitution officer. Oris distributed copies of the founding document summary, a version Seraphine had prepared specifically for general distribution, thorough without being technical, to anyone who asked. Several wolves stopped Seraphine individually. Not all of them were friendly. Several of them were, not warm exactly, but direct, which was the currency she'd always traded in, and she found it easier to work with than warmth that hadn't earned its temperature yet. One of them was an older woman she recognized from the training yards 20 years ago, who looked at her for a long moment and then said simply, "We should have spoken up," and then walked away before Seraphine could respond, which was perhaps the correct pace for that particular exchange. She was still holding the weight of it when Cale found her at the hall's edge, the crowd thinning around them. "All right," he said. "Yes," she paused. "That's mostly accurate. The woman who said they should have spoken up." She looked at him. "You heard that. I was nearby. Nearby with intent." "Yes." She looked at the clearing hall. "It's easier to work with than I expected," she said. "Honesty, even when it's late." She paused. "I thought it would only make me angrier, that it would be too late to matter." "Does it," he said, "make you angrier?" She thought about this honestly. "Not the way I expected." She looked at her hands. "It makes me tired. In a way that feels different from the tired I've been carrying for 5 years. That tired was something I was fighting. This one feels—" She stopped. "Like afterward," he said. She looked at him. "Yes." The hall was nearly empty now. The morning light had moved to afternoon angle, coming through the high windows at the slant that turned the old wood gold. It smelled like cedar and stone and the specific warmth of a space that had held a lot of people recently and was beginning to settle back into itself. "The conclave proceedings will take another 2 to 3 days," she said. "The restitution framework, the record corrections, the formal filing of the co-anchor petition with full documentation." She held his gaze. "After that, my assignment technically concludes." He was very still. "Technically," he said. "My mandate was the investigation," she said. "The investigation is closed. The perpetrator is in custody. The evidence is filed." She held his gaze steadily. "The co-anchor is a separate matter. The conclave doesn't require an emissary to remain on site for the anchor stabilization period." "No," he said, "it doesn't." "It also doesn't require them to leave." A pause. "No," he said, "it doesn't." The hall held its quiet around them, the specific quiet of a space that had just done something significant and was resting in the aftermath. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his face. not surprise. The shift of a man who had been waiting for the specific weight of this and was prepared to receive it. "Tell me," he said. "The pack address happens again in 6 months," she said. "A formal update, bond health data, anchor stability metrics, restitution progress for the victims' families. Publicly, no managed version." Agreed. "The founding documents go into the public record, not archived, accessible. Anyone in this pack who wants to understand the territory's history has the right to read it." Agreed. "The council restructuring happens with conclave oversight and includes structural protections against the kind of administrative consolidation that allowed Aldrich 60 years of unchecked authority." Agreed. She paused. He waited. "And you don't make decisions that affect me," she said, "without consulting me first. Not pack decisions, not bond anchor decisions, not anything." He held her gaze. "Agreed." "I mean it," she said. "I have spent 5 years building a self that doesn't require you. I am choosing, specifically, to bring it back to this territory, to this anchor, to you. That choice requires the thing you didn't give me 5 years ago." "Partnership," he said. Yes. I understand what I'm agreeing to." "I know you do," she said. "I need to hear it anyway." "Partnership," he said again, plainly, with the direct weight of a man saying a word he intended to mean. "In the anchor, in the pack, in the decisions that affect both of us." He held her gaze. "In everything that comes after this." The mate bond received it. She felt it move through her, not the desperate frequency of suppressed longing or the clinical register of operational assessment, but something that had been waiting, patient and specific, for exactly this combination of words and intent and earned honesty. "All right," she said. It meant everything it had been meaning all week, and several new things, and she let it mean all of them. He raised his hand, the same careful gesture as the chamber below, or the question rather than the assumption, and she stepped into it, into the specific warmth of him, and he folded his arms around her with the deliberateness of a man who understood that what he was holding had cost both of them substantially and intended to be worth the cost. The mate bond settled. Not resolved in the sense of completed. Bonds didn't complete. She understood this. They grew and complicated and required sustained attention, the way all living things did. But settled. The frantic frequency of 5 years of suppression gone quiet, replaced by something that had room to breathe and had decided for the moment simply to do that. She felt his chin against the top of her head. She felt the anchor above them in the bond chamber, complete and warm and stable in a way it had not been for 60 years. She felt Silvermore's territory around them, its forests, its ridges, its quarry and its common yards and its old stone hall, and it felt, for the first time since she was a child, standing barefoot on its soil and feeling it recognize her, like something that was genuinely and completely hers. "Ours," her wolf corrected, with tremendous satisfaction. "Fine," she conceded. "Ours." Chapter 10. 3 days later, when the conclave proceedings were formally concluded, and the last of the documentation was filed, and Fenn's team had packed their calibration instruments and departed with the efficiency of people who had other territories to assess, Seraphine stood in the records room alone and looked at the shelves. The gap where the removed pages had been was filled. Copies of the originals, sourced from the conclave's restricted archives, printed on paper that didn't match the surrounding volumes and probably never would, because historical accuracy and aesthetic continuity were not always compatible, and the records room was going to have to live with that. She found she didn't mind. She pulled the founding documents volume from the shelf, the one with the margin notation that had started all of this, the handwriting she now knew belonged to Aldrich's grandfather, the first of the Vane line to decide that the full record was less useful than the managed version. She read the margin notation one more time. See also, Voss lineage documentation, Conclave Restricted Series 7, 3 generations of concealment, written in a margin as a hedge against perfect suppression. As if the man who wrote it had known, somewhere in the accounting part of his mind. that a record this complete would eventually surface, as if he had wanted, despite everything, to leave one thread visible. She closed the volume and replaced it on the shelf. She thought about what Aldrich had said at the tribunal. "I have always been thorough." The specific pride of a man whose methods were monstrous and whose professionalism was genuine and who had never found a way to reconcile the distance between those two things. She thought about her own thoroughness. 3 years of case building, the suppression prescription, the careful construction of a self that could carry this weight independently, that didn't require the territory or the mate bond or the man whose signature on her exile order she had read until she had memorized the specific pressure of his pen. She had built herself very carefully. She intended to keep most of it. The door opened. Cale came in with the particular ease of a man who had learned over 3 days of conclave proceedings and pack assemblies and the slow work of an institution beginning to tell itself a truer story, that the records room was where she went when she needed to be somewhere quiet and had decided that knowing this was relevant. He sat on the bench at the room's edge without speaking. She noted that he had stopped announcing himself, had stopped filling silences for her benefit, had allowed the room to be what it was with both of them in it. She found this deeply comfortable. She was honest with herself about this. "The restitution framework is finalized," he said. "The victims' families have been formally notified. The council has approved the structural oversight provisions." He paused. "Oris is staying. The conclave is seconding her to Silvermore for 6 months to complete the founding document research. She seemed incandescent," Seraphine said. "That's the word." A pause. "Dara has formally requested co-appointment as PAC enforcement captain and conclave liaison. She wants the dual role, PAC authority and conclave accountability, built into the same position." "That's a good structure," Seraphine said. "I thought so." He paused. "I told her yes, after consulting you." She looked at him. He held her gaze with the specific expression of a man who had agreed to a thing and was honoring the agreement and wanted her to know that it was not a performance. "Good," she said. She crossed to the bench and sat beside him. The familiar proximity now, close enough to feel the warmth of him. The mate bond between them in its settled state, a constant she had stopped bracing against and begun simply inhabiting. "The 6-month anchor stabilization period?" she said. "Yes. I'll need a proper workspace. The records room is adequate, but the table is inadequate for the volume of documentation the co-anchor audit generates. I'll have one built. In the hall, not the residential wing. I work better when I'm close to the administrative center." Understood. "And I want regular reporting access to the PAC medical team's bond health assessments, not summaries, full data. I'll arrange it." She looked at the shelves. "The bond health improvements should be visible within the 1st month. The anchor stabilization data will show the gradient." She paused. "I want the PAC to be able to see it, not just be told it." "Visual displays in the common area," he said. "Monthly. I was going to suggest the same." She turned to look at him. He raised an eyebrow slightly, the specific expression of a man who had been thinking the same thoughts as the person beside him and was prepared to find this unremarkable. She felt again that thing that was dangerously close to humor. "We're going to argue," she said, "about PAC decisions, regularly. I want to be transparent about that." "I'm counting on it," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You're going to be unreasonable sometimes. Probably. And you're going to have to sit with that instead of defaulting to alpha authority." "Yes." A pause. "You're going to be right more often than is comfortable." "Frequently," she agreed. And I'm going to have to sit with that as well." "Yes." He turned to look at her directly. "I'm prepared for it." She studied him. The face that had been her reference point for 5 years of absence. The man she'd built architecture against and was now building something else with. The alpha whose bond anchor ran through hers like a lock receiving its key. The person who had looked at her with grief and had not defended himself against it. "I know," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Not dramatically, not with the weight of emotional culmination, Simply the way you lean toward warmth when you've been cold for a long time and there's no longer a reason to stand apart from it. His hand came to rest at the back of her head. Not possessive, present, the gesture of someone who understood the difference. They sat in the records room with the full record on the shelves around them, gaps filled, copies imperfect, the founding documents alongside the suppression evidence alongside the new pages Oris would add in the months ahead. And the territory breathed around them with the specific quality of a thing that had been held at tension for 60 years and was beginning, slowly, to release. The mate bond was quiet. Not absent. It would not be absent. It was a living thing, and living things were not quiet. They grew and shifted and required attention. But quiet the way a river is quiet when it has found its channel, moving without urgency, present without demand. Finally, her wolf said, with the tremendous patience of something that had been waiting for this specific outcome for a very long time and had never entirely stopped believing in it. Don't be smug, Seraphine told it. Her wolf, having earned the right, was somewhat smug anyway. 6 months later, the bond health data came in from the PAC medical team's quarterly assessment. Seraphine spread it across her workroom table, the proper table, built to specification, positioned in the hall's eastern administrative corridor with windows facing the tree line, and read through the numbers with the focused attention she'd applied to every piece of data that had crossed this table since she'd claimed it as her workspace. The gradient was visible, exactly as she had projected. PAC-wide bond stability up 37% from the baseline recorded at the investigation's conclusion. The improvement was uneven, some members showing faster recovery than others, which was expected given how long the incomplete anchor had been affecting the PAC's baseline. But the trajectory was consistent, and the outliers were explicable. Kale's alpha bond, fully stabilized. The blackened veins had disappeared entirely by the end of the second month. The anchor was holding the dual configuration with the specific robustness of a structure running at its designed capacity for the first time in 60 years. Her own bond sense, present and clear, the founding key's frequency in the anchor warm and distinct, the territory legible to her in a way that she was still learning the full vocabulary of, discovering new registers of recognition each week. She compiled the presentation for the morning's PAC assembly, the 6-month mark, the first of the formal public updates she'd committed to. The data visible and complete and unmanaged. A knock at the workroom door. "Come in," she said. Kyle entered with 2 cups of black tea. He set one beside her without comment, looked at the data spread across the table, and picked up the outlier analysis she'd flagged for discussion. "The Western Residential Cluster," he said. 3 members with slower recovery curves. I want the medical team to do individual assessments this week. She paused. "I think it's the proximity factor. They're further from the anchor chamber than the rest of the PAC. I want to check whether the stabilization radius extends fully to the western edge or whether we need to look at a secondary anchor point." He read the data, nodded. "I'll schedule the assessments. And I'll have Oris look at the founding documents for precedent on secondary anchor points. She found a reference last week in the pre-conclave supplementary materials that might be relevant." "Tell her to flag it for me directly," Seraphine said. "I want to read the original, not a summary." "She'll be delighted," he said dryly. "She's always delighted. It's efficient." He set down the outlier analysis and looked at the full data spread. She watched him read it the way she'd learned to watch him read things, not for the alpha's assessment, but for the actual response, the one that lived below the function. 37%, he said. "First quarter. The trajectory suggests we'll hit 50% by the year mark." He was quiet for a moment. "My father's tenure, the bond health data from his final years showed consistent decline. The medical team attributed it to age and PAC stress," she said. "I know. The actual cause was the incomplete anchor." "Yes, which means the decline was preventable. If the suppression had been corrected when he first discovered it." "Yes," she said, not softly, plainly. He held the weight of this. She let him hold it. She'd stopped trying to make the holding easier, having understood that making it easier was its own kind of management, and he'd asked her not to manage him. "He made a bad choice," Kyle said, "for reasons that were partly good and partly not, and the outcome was—" He stopped. "He was my father, and he was wrong." "Yes," she said. "I've been thinking about what that means, for how I hold his memory." "What have you decided?" He looked at her. "That holding it correctly is more important than holding it comfortably." She held his gaze. "That's the right answer. It's a difficult one. Most right answers are." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been reading the Conclave's secondary anchor case files." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Oris mentioned you'd requested the archive access 3 weeks ago." A pause. "You're researching the Western Cluster problem." "Among other things." "What other things?" She looked at her data, then at him. "The founding documents describe the Voss-Dravenmore configuration as designed for expansion. The dual anchor wasn't just meant to serve Silvermore as it was at founding. It was built with the capacity to extend its reach as the pack grew." She paused. "We're operating at the founding-era geographic radius. But the pack is larger now. The Western Cluster's recovery lag might not just be a proximity issue." "The anchor needs to expand," he said. "The anchor was built to expand," she said. "If the co-anchor holders choose to extend it, it's a decision, not an automatic function." He looked at her steadily. "What does extending it involve?" "Extended dual presence at the territory's boundaries. Formal intention declaration, similar to the co-anchor claiming. 3 boundary points, minimum." She held his gaze. "Time, possibly a full day's circuit of the territory." He looked at the data, at the Western Cluster's outliers, at the trajectory projection. "When do you want to start?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. The specific look. The one that had been developing its vocabulary since the records room and the bond chamber and the stone room beneath the ancestral hall and every conversation in between. "This week," she said, "after the pack assembly." "Good." He picked up his tea, looked at the workroom, her documentation, her table, the window facing the tree line, the space that had shaped itself around 5 months of her specific occupation of it. "The pack assembly is in 2 hours." "I know. You haven't eaten." She looked at her documentation. "I ate." "When?" She calculated. "This morning." He set his cup down, turned, and walked toward the door with the decisive motion of a man who had decided something and was acting on it. "Dara is holding the assembly briefing in 20 minutes. Eat something before then." "That's not a request," she said. "No," he said. From the doorway. "It isn't." She looked at his back. "Partnership," she said. He turned, met her gaze. "Partnership includes the part where I notice when you haven't eaten and say something about it. And the part where I tell you that's overstepping. And the part where we disagree about whether it is." A pause. "Are we disagreeing?" She held his gaze for a long moment. "Get out of my workroom," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. That expression, the one that appeared without announcement and meant more than it occupied. 20 minutes, he said. He left. She sat with the silence for a moment. Then she picked up her data and her tea and the specific warmth that had taken up permanent residence somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum, and she went to find something to eat before the assembly. The assembly was full again. 6 months on, the hall's atmosphere had shifted in ways that were specific and measurable, the way bond health data was specific and measurable, not transformed, not resolved into some frictionless new state, but changed. The families of the victims sat in the front rows with the Conclave restitution officer, reviewing the quarterly progress report on their formal proceedings. The council, restructured under its new oversight provisions, occupied the side seats with the specific bearing of people who were learning to operate under greater scrutiny and finding it both uncomfortable and clarifying. The woman from the third row was in the second row now. She had introduced herself, 2 months in, as Mira, and had asked 3 of the most technically precise questions about anchor stabilization methodology that Seraphine had encountered outside the Conclave's own specialist corps. She was, it turned out, one of Silvermore's pack medical analysts, and she had been quietly tracking the bond health decline for 4 years without a framework to explain it. She had the framework now. She used it with the enthusiasm of someone given the correct tool after years of working around its absence. Seraphine presented the data. She had not, over 6 months, become someone who enjoyed public addresses. She remained efficient about them, structured, clear, the minimum theatrical content necessary to hold a large room's attention without performing for it. But she had become, she admitted to herself, someone who understood what she was doing it for. She could see the pack metabolizing the information in real time, the specific texture of a community that had learned, through repeated honest accounting, that the information would be given to them without management and had begun to extend toward it accordingly. Trust was, she was finding, a thing that developed the way anchor stabilization developed, gradually, measurably, in ways that required sustained attention but rewarded it. Cale spoke after her. He was better at the public address than she was. The Alpha Register had genuine weight in a large room, and he'd learned in 6 months to use it for honesty rather than reassurance, which was a different and more difficult deployment of the same tool. He presented the Western Cluster data and the territorial expansion decision without framing it as resolved. "We're in the assessment phase," he said. "The data suggests expansion is warranted. The process will take time. You'll have the results of each boundary assessment as they're completed." He paused. "As with everything, you'll have the full picture, not the edited version." Questions from the floor. Mira asked 2 of them. Both required technical answers that Seraphine provided. Another wolf, young, from the Enforcer Corps, who had joined after the tribunal, asked whether the Conclave's secondment of Oris could be extended beyond 6 months, because the founding document research was generating implications that felt far from complete. "The request is already filed," Seraphine said. Oris, from the side of the hall, made a small sound of extreme satisfaction. The assembly concluded. The hall cleared with the easy rhythm of a community that had practice at this now, the specific social pace of a group that had learned to move through shared information together. Cale found her at the hall's edge. They stood together and watched the pack move through, Dara coordinating the Enforcer Corps debrief, Oris collecting the founding document queries she'd fielded during the assembly's question period, Mira discussing bond health data with 2 of her medical team colleagues, the families of the victims leaving together with a coherence that had been absent in the early months and was present now. "The boundary circuit," Cale said. "Thursday." "Thursday," she agreed. "Early start. The northern boundary is the farthest." "I know the territory." "You know it differently now," he said, "as co-anchor holder." "It reads differently." She looked at him. He was right. The territory had been developing new legibility since the recalibration, the founding key's connection to the land-building vocabulary she was still learning, landmarks she had known by sight acquiring a second register of bond sense meaning. "It does," she said. "The Northwest Ridge," he said. "In winter. The bond sense at the high elevation." "Show me Thursday," she said. He looked at her with the specific directness that had stopped being alarming and become simply the way he looked at her. "Yes," he said. Around them, Silvermore's hall carried its ordinary afternoon sounds, conversation, movement, the distant training yard, the specific texture of a settlement going about its life in the unremarkable way that settlements did when the structures holding them were sound. The mate bond was present and quiet and completely unhurried. She stood in the hall she had walked into 6 months ago as an emissary with documentation and professional distance and a suppression prescription that had stopped working, and she stood in it now as something that had no clean official category. Co-anchor holder, founding key, conclave emissary on extended secondment, the woman whose exile had been corrected and whose name was in the public record and whose wolf was currently experiencing a level of territorial contentment that bordered on the embarrassing. "I earned it," her wolf said. We earned it, she conceded. Yes, her wolf agreed. We. She looked at the hall, the old wood and the high windows and the imperfect copies on the records room shelves and the bond anchor below and the territory breathing around all of it. And she held the full record in her mind without flinching from any of it. The parts that were her fault, the parts that weren't, the 5 years, the case she'd built, the choice she'd made in the bond chamber when she could have used the conclave sigil and had chosen instead to trust the man on the other side of the room. Cale's shoulder was against hers. She leaned into it, not dramatically, not with the weight of a moment announcing itself, simply the natural adjustment of a body that had, over 6 months of proximate honesty, learned where its warmth came from and stopped performing distance from it. Finally, her wolf said again, quietly, with the satisfaction of something that had waited a very long time and found the waiting to have been, ultimately, worth the cost. Seraphine, for once, did not argue, and so Silvermore's full record was written. Not the clean version, not the one that makes the founding story simple or the redemption neat or the exile a thing that can be fully repaid. The version that is true, fractured and costly and earned in the specific way that things which matter are always earned. But before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. Seraphine came back to this territory with every reason to take it entirely. The founding claim was hers. The legal standing was hers. 5 years of unjust exile. Her name in a false record. A pack that looked away while it happened. And she had the power to displace every part of it. She chose co-anchor instead. She chose partnership with the man who signed her banishment order. Here is my question. Was she right to? Not was it romantic? Not was it satisfying? Was it right? Did Cale Dravenmore earn what she gave him? Or did the mate bond and the anchor's structure and 5 years of Seraphine's own longing make the choice for her in ways she couldn't see clearly enough to resist? Tell me in the comments. I want the honest answer, not the one that makes the story feel better. If you want to hear what comes next, the territorial expansion, the Conclave's response to the co-anchor precedent, and what Silvermore becomes when it finally runs at its full designed capacity, let me know. The record continues.